The invisible walls. I once believed the world belonged to everyone. Until I saw the walls no one else could see. Invisible boundaries dividing the city into separate pieces, imprisoning people in cages they never knew existed. My name is Min, and I'm the only person in Division 22 who can see the walls. At first, I thought I was suffering from a psychotic break. Transparent, shimmering barriers that appeared overnight like heat waves rising from asphalt. But when I walked into one and felt the solid, immovable resistance against my palms, I understood the terrible truth: the walls were real, and they were everywhere. What I didn't understand yet was why I alone could see them, or that this unwanted gift would make me both the most dangerous person in the city and its only hope for freedom. Chapter 1. The First Wall. The first wall appeared on my 27th birthday. I was walking home from the Community Productivity Center, taking my usual route through Harmony Park, when I noticed a strange distortion in the air ahead of me. It reminded me of the way the world looks above a lit match, a subtle wavering as if reality itself was rippling. I blinked several times, rubbed my eyes, but the distortion remained. Curious rather than concerned, I approached it. The wavering air formed a perfect vertical plane stretching from the ground up as far as I could see and extending to either side beyond my vision. Other people walked through the area without hesitation, without so much as a glance at the anomaly I was seeing. When I reached out and touched it, my fingers met solid resistance. Smooth, slightly warm, utterly impenetrable. I pushed harder, then placed my palm flat against the invisible surface. It felt like glass, but somehow softer, almost organic. "Excuse me," I said to a woman passing by. "Do you see this wall?" She gave me the swift, suspicious glance citizens had been conditioned to offer anyone speaking out of turn in public spaces. Her eyes darted to my gray uniform, identical to hers, marking us both as organizational level 3 workers, then to my civic contribution badge pinned properly on my left shoulder. "What wall?" she asked, her voice precisely calibrated to express both mild concern and appropriate distance. "This." I knocked on the invisible barrier, producing no sound. "Right here." The woman took a small step back. "There's nothing there, citizen. Perhaps you should report to a wellness center." She continued on her way, walking directly through what to me was clearly a solid barrier. I watched in astonishment as she passed through it without resistance, without even noticing. I stood there for a long time, knocking against the invisible wall, watching others pass through it effortlessly, while it remained solid to my touch. Eventually, I walked around it, following its boundary until I found its edge about 50 meters to the left. Beyond that point, I could pass through normally, which I did, continuing my journey home with a growing sense of unease. That night, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a strange neurological event perhaps caused by overwork or lack of sleep. I decided that if it happened again, I would report to a wellness center as the woman had suggested. But I didn't, because by the next morning, I could see more of them. And I was beginning to understand what they were. The walls formed a precise grid throughout Division 22, creating invisible, but to me, clearly defined sectors. They didn't follow the physical layout of the city. They cut through buildings, streets, and parks without regard for existing architecture. Some enclosed small areas of only a few blocks. Others spanned larger sections of the division. And I was the only one who could see them. For 3 days, I observed. I watched how people moved through the city, trying to determine if the walls affected them, despite their inability to see the barriers. What I discovered was subtle but unmistakable. No one ever crossed between sectors except at specific points that I came to think of as gates. Places where the invisible walls had openings. These gates weren't marked in any official way, but they always had certain characteristics: surveillance cameras, civic harmony officers casually positioned nearby, and often small administrative kiosks where citizens would pause briefly before passing through. Most disturbing of all, I began to notice patterns in who passed through which gates. Citizens in blue uniforms, organizational level 5 and above, could move freely through most gates. Those in gray like me were restricted to fewer crossing points, and the occasional brown uniformed level 1 workers I saw were channeled through only the most heavily monitored gates, always with credential checks. We were being segregated, controlled, and contained, and nobody knew it. I decided to test my theory. On the fourth day after seeing the first wall, I approached a gate I had never used before, one that connected my residential sector to the adjacent cultural center sector. It wasn't on my approved transit route, but there was nothing officially preventing Level 3 citizens from visiting cultural centers during leisure hours. As I approached the gate, a civic harmony officer casually shifted his position to observe me more directly. At the small kiosk, a bored-looking attendant glanced up. "Citizen identification?" she asked. I held out my wrist for scanning, the standard procedure for any administrative interaction. The scanner beeped and the attendant frowned slightly at her screen. "What is your purpose in Cultural Sector 8 today?" "Citizen Min. I wish to visit the exhibition on efficient living through innovative design," I said, naming a display I had seen advertised on the Community Information Network. She tapped something on her screen, studied it, then nodded. "Proceed reminder that this sector closes to Level 3 access at 2000 hours. Acknowledged. Harmony in efficiency." I replied with the standard phrase, "Efficiency in harmony." She completed automatically. I passed through the gate, feeling the strange sensation of moving through what my eyes told me was a solid barrier, but my body experienced as empty air. Once on the other side, I continued walking normally, projecting the purposeful confidence all citizens were encouraged to display. But inside my mind was racing. The walls were real. Not physically real, perhaps, but real in effect. The city was divided into invisible sectors with movement between them. Subtly but definitely controlled. Citizens were permitted to go only where their organizational level and specific permissions allowed, funneled through paths determined by authorities. And somehow I could see the entire system laid bare. I spent the next week mapping the walls and gates throughout Division 22, creating a mental model of the invisible infrastructure overlaid on the physical city. I noted which gates allowed passage for which organizational levels, what times they operated, and how heavily they were monitored. What emerged was a complex, hierarchical system of control. The higher your organizational level, the more sectors you could access. Level 6 and above. Citizens, identified by their white uniforms, could move almost everywhere. Level 1 workers in brown were essentially confined to industrial sectors and their assigned residential areas. But even within organizational levels, there were further subdivisions. Some gray uniformed Level 3 citizens like me could access educational sectors that others could not. Some could enter administrative sectors during specific hours, while others were restricted. The system was intricate, personalized, and because no one could see the walls entirely invisible to those it controlled, I had always believed I lived in a society of reasonable freedom. Yes, there were rules and hierarchies, but I thought they were transparent, understandable, necessary for efficiency. Now I saw the truth. Our movements were being precisely managed without our knowledge or consent, guided by invisible barriers that herded us along predetermined paths. The question was, why could I see them when no one else could? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? My position at the Data Harmonization Center gave me certain advantages in seeking answers. As a Level 3 data reconciliation specialist, my job was to ensure consistency across multiple civic information systems, identifying and resolving discrepancies in everything from production quotas to citizen wellness scores. It wasn't a particularly prestigious position, but it granted me access to a wide range of databases that might help me understand what the walls were and why I alone could see them. Working late again, Min. My supervisor coordinator, Tran, appeared beside my terminal. His blue Level 4 uniform was, as always, perfectly pressed, the silver trim gleaming under the office lights. "Just resolving some anomalies in the civic infrastructure database," I replied smoothly, switching my screen to a legitimate work task. "Commendable dedication," he said, though his tone suggested mild suspicion rather than genuine approval. "But remember that extended unscheduled work hours can create inconsistencies in wellness monitoring." Translation: don't stay too late or you'll trigger flags in the system. "Of course. Coordinator, I'll complete this reconciliation and depart." He nodded and moved on to his next task. Always efficient, always watching. Like most Level 4 supervisors, Coordinator Tran had clearly defined career aspirations that involved regular reports on his subordinates' productivity and compliance. He wasn't malicious, just ambitious within the system's parameters. Once he was safely engaged with another data technician, I returned to my illicit research. I had been scouring historical infrastructure records, looking for any mention of the wall system. So far, I had found nothing explicit, no project files, no maintenance records, no technical specifications, but I had discovered something unusual approximately 15 years ago. There had been a massive division-wide infrastructure project called the Civic Harmony Enhancement Initiative. The public-facing description was vague, referring to improvements in community flow dynamics and optimized citizen interaction patterns, but the actual technical details were classified beyond my access level. What I could see was that following this initiative, there had been significant changes in urban movement patterns. The data showed subtle but definite shifts in where citizens of different organizational levels lived, worked, and spent leisure time. Sectors became more homogeneous. Interaction between levels decreased by 47%, all without building a single visible wall. I was so engrossed in these discoveries that I almost missed the alert notification on my terminal. Someone had remotely activated my workstation's surveillance protocol. They were watching my searches in real time. Quickly, I switched to legitimate work, pulling up the infrastructure anomaly report I'd mentioned to Coordinator Tran. But it was too late. The damage was done. Someone knew I had been looking into the Civic Harmony Enhancement Initiative. As I gathered my things to leave, I noticed Coordinator Tran watching me from across the office, speaking quietly into his communication device. His expression was unreadable, but the set of his shoulders conveyed tension. I maintained a calm demeanor as I walked to the transit platform, hyper-aware of the invisible walls around me. The gates I passed through the surveillance cameras tracking my movement. Nothing seemed immediately different, no. Civic Harmony officers approached me. No alert sounded on my personal communication device. But something had changed. I could feel it in the subtle shift of attention as I boarded the transit pod. The system knew I had been looking where I shouldn't. The question now was how quickly they would come for me. My residential unit was standard for a Level 3 citizen living alone, a 40-square-meter efficiency apartment in a 200-unit building reserved for Data Harmonization Center employees. It was comfortable enough with the usual amenities, sleep space, hygiene chamber, nutrition area, and a small relaxation nook with entertainment access. I had always considered it adequate. Now, as I entered and secured the door behind me, it felt like a cage. I immediately checked for signs of intrusion, but found none. The entry log showed no access since my departure that morning. The environmental settings remained at my preferred levels. Nothing was visibly disturbed. Still, unease prickled along my spine. If the authorities suspected I could see the walls, they wouldn't necessarily rush to apprehend me. They might watch first, gathering data, assessing the scope of my awareness. I needed to be careful, but I also needed answers urgently. My personal data terminal had considerably less access than my workstation, but it was also less monitored. I began searching for any information about people who could see invisible infrastructure, unusual visual perception disorders, or anomalies in the Civic Harmony Enhancement Initiative. Most searches yielded nothing useful. General medical information, historical accounts of optical illusions, technical specifications for holographic advertising displays. But when I searched for Harmony Enhancement Perception Exceptions, the terminal displayed an unusual message. Search query redirected for optimized Civic Harmony. And then, instead of search results, a single line of text appeared. You are not alone. Central Library History, Section 1430, tomorrow. The message disappeared almost immediately, replaced by standard search results about perception enhancement therapies. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Someone had intercepted my search query and sent me a direct message, someone who wasn't part of the official system. It could be a trap. Civic Harmony officers might be using this method to confirm my anomalous perception before apprehending me. But something about the message, its brevity, its directness, the fact that it had vanished so quickly suggested otherwise. I spent a restless night weighing my options. Going to the Central Library as instructed could lead to capture interrogation, perhaps worse. Not going meant continuing in ignorance, waiting for authorities to eventually identify me as a perception anomaly. Neither choice was safe. In the end, curiosity and the desperate need for answers outweighed caution. I would go to the library, but I would take precautions. The next morning proceeded with disturbing normality. One, at the Data Harmonization Center, treated me differently. Coordinator Tran assigned me standard reconciliation tasks. The surveillance protocol on my terminal appeared inactive. It was as if yesterday's security alert had never happened. That more than anything confirmed my suspicions. The system was watching me, but didn't want me to know. At precisely 1400, I requested a short wellness break, which was routinely granted to all employees once per shift. Instead of going to the wellness chamber, however, I took the emergency stairs to the ground floor, exited through a service corridor, and boarded a public transit pod, heading in the opposite direction from the central library. 3 transit changes later, having carefully evaded the standard tracking protocols, I approached the library from the northeast, a direction I never normally came from. I entered through a side access point used primarily by maintenance staff, nodded confidently to the surveillance camera as if I belonged, and made my way to the history section on the 3rd floor. The Central Library was one of the few places in Division 22 where citizens of all organizational levels could freely intermingle, though in practice they rarely did. Level 1 workers had little leisure time for reading, while Level 6 administrators typically accessed information directly through their enhanced personal terminals. The physical library was primarily used by mid-level citizens like me and educational groups on structured learning experiences. Today, the history section was nearly empty, just a few scattered readers and a small group of adolescents with their educational coordinator. I pretended to browse the physical text archives, moving slowly through the aisles of preservation-sealed books, waiting for some sign of my mysterious contact. At exactly 14:30, every screen in the library blinked momentarily, a tiny glitch that most patrons didn't even notice. But in that instant, I saw something change in the invisible walls that crossed through the building. A small rectangular opening appeared in the wall nearest to me, leading into a section of the library I had never noticed before, a section that, according to my mental map of the walls, should not have been accessible from this part of the building. Without hesitation, I stepped through the temporary opening. As soon as I passed through, the wall closed behind me, and I found myself in a narrow corridor lined with ancient paper-bound books, the kind kept only for historical preservation, not practical use. At the end of the corridor stood a woman in a simple gray jumpsuit like mine, but without any organizational insignia or citizen identification visible. She was perhaps 50 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and dark eyes that assessed me with clinical precision. "You're late," she said, though I had arrived exactly at the specified time. "I took precautions," I replied. She nodded approvingly. "Good. That suggests you might survive this. My name is Dr. Lian. I designed the walls you've been seeing." The directness of her statement stunned me. I had expected evasion, cryptic hints, perhaps a gradual revelation of knowledge. Instead, she had immediately confirmed the wall's existence and her connection to them. "Why can I see them?" I asked, deciding to match her directness. "An unintended side effect of the SS7 gene therapy you received as a child," she said, gesturing for me to follow her deeper into the hidden section. "It was meant to correct your congenital retinal issue. Instead, it interacted with a rare neurotransmitter variant in your visual cortex, making you sensitive to the quantum vibration frequency of the nanomesh barriers." Nanomesh barriers, I repeated, putting a name to the phenomenon for the first time. "They're physically real, then, not holograms or some form of mass hallucination." Dr. Lian gave me a look that bordered on pity. "Of course they're real. Nearly microscopic filaments of quantum-aligned carbon, creating barriers impermeable to organic matter, but allowing light, sound, and air to pass freely. The perfect control mechanism, invisible, inaudible, impossible to prove without specialized equipment, yet entirely effective at segregating the population however the administration desires." We entered a small room filled with outdated technical equipment and stacks of physical documents, actual paper yellowed with age. On one wall hung a massive diagram of Division 22 overlaid with precisely the pattern of walls I had been seeing. "You designed this system," I said, staring at the diagram. Why are you telling me about it now? She sat down heavily in a worn chair. Because I made a terrible mistake, and you're one of the very few people who might help me correct it. How many others can see the walls? In Division 22. Just you, as far as we know. Across all 12 divisions, we've identified 27 individuals with the perception ability. Most don't survive long after they start asking questions about what they're seeing. The implications sent a chill through me. And why am I still alive? Because I intervened, she said simply. When your search queries triggered the anomalous perception alerts, I intercepted them and redirected the notification protocols. As far as the system knows, your terminal malfunctioned, but that protection is temporary. They'll identify you eventually. I studied the woman carefully, looking for deception. Why would you help me? Why risk exposure? Dr. Lian sighed suddenly, looking much older than her apparent age. Because the walls were never supposed to be permanent. They were designed as a temporary measure during the resource allocation crisis, a way to efficiently distribute essentials while maintaining civic harmony. Once stability returned, they were to be deactivated. But they weren't. I guessed no. The administration discovered that the walls provided unprecedented population control. Crime rates dropped to near zero. Productivity increased by 22%. Civic harmony scores reached record highs. So instead of deactivating the system, they expanded it, refined it, made it the invisible foundation of our entire social structure. She gestured to the diagram. What you see now is the 15th iteration of the wall system. Each version more comprehensive, more subtle, more effective at herding citizens through their lives without their knowledge or consent. A perfect cage made of nothing but air and nanomesh. And you want to destroy it? I asked. No, she said, her voice hardening. I want to make everyone see it. Dr. Lian's plan was both elegantly simple and breathtakingly dangerous. As the original architect of the Nanomesh barrier system, she had maintained limited access to its operational protocols, not enough to deactivate it, but potentially enough to modify certain parameters. The walls generate a quantum interference pattern at a frequency just beyond normal human perception, she explained, showing me schematics on an ancient data tablet. Your enhanced visual cortex can process this frequency, which is why you see them as subtle distortions in the air. And you want to shift this frequency into the visible spectrum for everyone? I asked, beginning to understand. She nodded. Exactly. A small adjustment to the resonance modulators would bring the interference pattern into general perceptibility. Suddenly, every citizen would see the invisible infrastructure that has been controlling their movements for the past 15 years. The administration would just claim it's a temporary visual phenomenon, I pointed out, some kind of atmospheric effect or mass hallucination. Perhaps initially. Dr. Lian agreed, but the walls are everywhere, dividing citizens based on arbitrary organizational levels, restricting movement in ways that have no logical justification. Once people can see their cage, they'll begin questioning why it exists at all. And then we have a chance for real change. Not the carefully controlled civil discourse that never challenges fundamental power structures, but genuine questioning of why our society needs invisible walls to function. It sounded compelling, even revolutionary, but something wasn't adding up. If you have access to the resonance modulators, why do you need me? I asked. Why not make this modification yourself? Dr. Lian's expression clouded. Because my access is limited to theoretical adjustments, not practical implementation. The actual modulation controls are housed in the Central Harmony Administration Complex, specifically in the CEHEI Control Center on Sub-Level 3. Now I understood which you can't access because there's a wall, she finished. A very special wall that I cannot see and cannot pass through. It was added in the 12th iteration specifically to prevent the system's designers from tampering with it. But you can see all the walls, including that one. You want me to physically infiltrate the most secure facility in Division 22, locate a classified control center, and modify the fundamental frequency of a system. I barely understand. I summarized, yes, that's suicide, I said flatly. Almost certainly, she agreed, which is why I've been searching for someone with your perceptual ability who also has the necessary technical background and access permissions to potentially succeed. My level 3 clearance won't get me anywhere near the central administration complex. I protested. Dr. Leon smiled for the first time, a thin, calculating expression. That's where you're wrong. Your specific role in data reconciliation grants you emergency access to all infrastructure systems in case of critical harmonization failures. It's rarely used, but the protocol exists and remains active. She handed me a small data chip. This contains a simulated critical failure in the civic infrastructure database that will require on-site verification at the Central Harmony Administration Complex. It will grant you temporary level 5 access, enough to reach sub-level 3 if you're careful. I stared at the chip, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Why should I risk my life for this? What happens if I just walk away? Forget I ever saw the walls. You can try, she said simply. But now that you've seen them, now that you understand the extent of control they represent, could you really go back to being a contented data specialist, knowing you're living in an invisible prison? She had a point. Since seeing the first wall, something fundamental had shifted in my perception of our society. What I had once accepted as rational, efficient organization now revealed itself as insidious control. Invisible boundaries, determining where we could go, who we could interact with, what opportunities were available to us all without our knowledge or consent. And if I agree, I asked, what happens if we succeed? Chaos initially, Dr. Lyon admitted, confusion, denial, probably civil unrest, but also the possibility of genuine freedom, a society where barriers are visible and therefore subject to collective decision-making, not imposed from above without awareness. I took the data chip, turning it over in my fingers. When would this happen? Tomorrow, she said. The sooner the better. Your unusual search queries have already triggered alerts. Even with my intervention, they'll identify you as a perception anomaly within days, perhaps hours. You're asking me to potentially sacrifice my life on almost no preparation, I pointed out. Yes, she said again, unflinching, because sometimes seeing the truth leaves you with only bad choices. You can run and hide waiting for them to find you, or you can act with a small chance of creating meaningful change. I pocketed the data chip, still uncertain, but recognizing the terrible logic of her argument. I'll need detailed instructions on exactly what modifications to make to the resonance modulators. Dr. Leon's relief was palpable. I've prepared everything you'll need, she said, handing me a second, smaller data chip. This contains the precise sequence of adjustments designed to be as quick and simple as possible. And after I make these adjustments, assuming I survive long enough to complete them, what happens to me? Her expression grew solemn. I've prepared an emergency extraction route that should give you a fighting chance. Beyond that, she spread her hands in a gesture of uncertainty. None of us can see beyond the walls until they're visible to everyone. As I left the hidden section of the library, through a different exit than I had entered, emerging in the public archives as if I had been there all along, I tried to process everything I had learned. The walls were real, constructed from nanomesh material vibrating at quantum frequencies. They had been designed as a temporary measure during a crisis, but maintained as a permanent control mechanism. And tomorrow, I would attempt to make them visible to everyone or die trying. The weight of this knowledge, the responsibility of the choice I faced, was almost overwhelming. But as I navigated the familiar paths back to my residential unit, carefully passing through the invisible gates that had always guided my movements without my awareness, I felt something unexpected. A sense of purpose, more real, more vital than anything the system had ever assigned to me. That night, I prepared as best I could for what might be my final mission. I studied the schematics Dr. Leon had provided, memorizing the layout of the Central Harmony Administration Complex and the specific location of the resonance modulators on sub-level 3. I practiced the sequence of adjustments I would need to make, committing them to muscle memory so I could execute them quickly under pressure. I also prepared for the likelihood of failure. I gathered what few personal possessions held meaning for me, a rare physical photograph of my parents before they were reassigned to Division 17. A small piece of natural wood my grandfather had given me, technically contraband, but I had kept it hidden for years, and the collection of private journals I had maintained since adolescence. These items I sealed in a preservation bag, along with a written account of everything I had learned about the walls and Dr. Lyon's plan. I addressed the package to Coordinator Tran, not because I trusted him particularly, but because his ambition might lead him to actually examine the contents rather than immediately reporting them to Civic Harmony officers. Whether my actions the next day succeeded or failed, I wanted some record of the truth to survive. Sleep was impossible, so I spent the remaining hours of darkness standing at my window looking out at the nighttime cityscape of Division 22. From my vantage point on the 18th floor, I could see the invisible walls crisscrossing between buildings running through parks, dividing neighborhoods into precisely controlled sectors, beautiful in their geometric perfection, terrifying in their implication. Had anyone else ever stood at a window like this, seeing what I saw? Feeling the same mix of wonder and horror? Had they acted or remained silent? Had they survived? As dawn broke over the eastern wall of the division, I ate a careful meal dressed in my cleanest uniform and prepared myself mentally for what was to come. I would likely not see another sunset, but if Dr. Lian's plan worked, maybe others would see the sunset differently, framed not by invisible barriers, but by the knowledge of what those barriers had been. I inserted the data chip containing the simulated critical failure into my personal terminal and initiated the emergency protocol. Within seconds, my communication device pinged with an urgent notification: Civic Infrastructure Database. Critical anomaly detected, Zone 22C17. Physical verification required, emergency clearance, authorized, report to Central Harmony Administration Complex immediately. The system had accepted the simulated failure as genuine. Phase 1 of the plan was successful. I gathered my things, including the second data chip with the resonance modulator adjustment sequence hidden in a small compartment in my citizen identification bracelet. Taking one last look at my residential unit, I stepped out into the corridor, closed the door behind me, and headed toward what would likely be my final mission as Citizen Min Data Reconciliation Specialist Level 3. The transit pod to the Central Administration Complex was nearly empty, just me and two white-uniformed Level 6 administrators engrossed in their personal data displays. They barely glanced at my gray uniform, certainly didn't notice the slight tremor in my hands or the tension in my jaw. The pod glided silently through the early morning city, passing through a dozen invisible walls that parted automatically for authorized transit systems. I had never fully appreciated the comprehensive nature of the barrier network until now, seeing how it permeated every aspect of urban infrastructure while remaining completely imperceptible to those it controlled. The Central Harmony Administration Complex dominated the heart of Division 22, a massive structure of gleaming metal and polarized glass rising 60 stories above ground, and I now knew extending at least 3 levels below. I had never had reason to enter it before, had only seen it from outside, like most ordinary citizens. As the transit pod docked at the main arrivals platform, I felt a moment of paralyzing doubt. Was I really going to attempt this? Was making the walls visible worth the certain sacrifice of my life? But then I remembered the fundamental deception at the heart of our society. Invisible barriers herding us through predetermined paths, separating us from each other based on arbitrary designations, all without our knowledge or consent. A perfect system of control because it could not be seen, could not be questioned, could not be resisted. I stepped out of the pod and approached the main security checkpoint. My citizen identification bracelet extended the emergency authorization notification prominently displayed on my communication device. Purpose? Asked the Civic Harmony officer at the checkpoint, barely looking up from his monitoring station. Emergency data reconciliation, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Critical infrastructure anomaly in Zone 22C17. He scanned my bracelet, checked his screen, then nodded curtly. Level 5 temporary access authorized infrastructure systems are on Level 17 and Sub-Level 3. Follow the green guidance lights to the appropriate elevator bank. Heart pounding. I moved through the checkpoint, half expecting alarms to sound at any moment. But nothing happened. The simulated emergency was holding my temporary clearance accepted without question. Green lights illuminated along the floor, guiding me through the vast atrium toward a bank of elevators marked for authorized personnel only. As I walked, I scanned for the invisible walls that I knew must permeate this building. They were everywhere, intricate, overlapping patterns, creating a labyrinth of segregated zones, with certain areas walled off completely from general access. I entered the elevator alone and selected Sub-Level 3 from the available options. The car began its descent smoothly without requesting additional verification. So far, the plan was proceeding perfectly, which only increased my anxiety. Nothing was ever this easy in the carefully controlled systems of Division 22. The elevator opened onto a sterile corridor with blank white walls and recessed lighting. More green guidance lights activated along the floor, directing me to the left. I followed them cautiously, noting the invisible walls that crossed the corridor at regular intervals, walls that I could see, but could also pass through thanks to my temporary Level 5 access. According to Dr. Leon's schematics, the CHEI Control Center should be approximately 70 meters ahead behind a security door, marked with the Civic Harmony Enhancement Initiative insignia. I moved forward steadily, trying to project the confidence of someone with legitimate business in this restricted area. The corridor branched several times, but the green guidance lights continued to direct me accurately, until suddenly they diverted me to the right away from the route I had memorized. Something was wrong. Either Dr. Leon's information was outdated or the system had detected an anomaly in my access pattern. I hesitated at the junction, looking ahead where the lights no longer illuminated. And there I saw it. The special wall Dr. Leon had mentioned. Unlike the standard invisible barriers, this one had a subtle iridescent quality, like oil on water. It stretched across the corridor that should have led directly to the CHEI Control Center, creating a barrier that even Level 5 access apparently could not penetrate. This was the wall specifically designed to keep the system's creators from accessing the controls, the wall that Dr. Leon could neither see nor pass through. But I could see it. And according to her theory, my perception might allow me to find a way past it. I ignored the green guidance lights and continued straight ahead, approaching the iridescent barrier cautiously. When I reached it, I placed my palm against its surface, feeling the now familiar resistance of Nanomesh, but with a different quality, almost a vibration beneath my touch. Looking more closely, I noticed that this wall was not perfectly uniform like the others. Near the floor, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it, was a small disruption in the pattern. A flaw, perhaps, or possibly an intentional feature left by the original designers. I knelt down to examine it. The disruption was about 10 centimeters in diameter, a spot where the iridescent shimmer swirled in a tiny vortex pattern rather than forming a smooth surface. When I cautiously touched this anomaly, my fingers met less resistance. Not an opening exactly, but a thinning in the barrier. Taking a deep breath, I pressed my hand firmly against the vortex pattern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, my fingers began to sink into the wall, passing through with a strange tingling sensation. I pushed harder, and my entire hand slipped through, followed by my arm. The wall seemed to resist more as I tried to push my shoulder and head through the small disruption, but I persisted, forcing my body into the nanomesh barrier with steadily increasing pressure. The sensation was profoundly uncomfortable, like pushing through extremely dense cobwebs that clung to every inch of skin, but not actually painful. After what seemed an eternity of struggle, I tumbled through to the other side, gasping and disoriented. I had made it past the special wall, something that should have been impossible for anyone, even its creators. Ahead lay a simple security door marked with the CHEI insignia, exactly as Dr. Leon had described. There was no obvious surveillance equipment. No security officers, no additional checkpoints, just a standard palm scanner beside the door. This was the moment of truth. Either my temporary Level 5 access would be sufficient to open this door, or it would trigger security protocols that would bring Civic Harmony officers running. I pressed my palm to the scanner, holding my breath. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the scanner glowed green, and the door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. I stepped into the CHEI Control Center, the heart of the invisible system that had been controlling the movements and interactions of millions of citizens for 15 years. It was remarkably small and austere. A circular room, perhaps 10 meters in diameter, with a central pillar housing what appeared to be the primary control interfaces. The walls were lined with monitoring screens showing various sectors of Division 22, with the invisible barriers clearly visible on the displays, so the administration could see the walls even though citizens could not. I approached the central pillar, scanning the unfamiliar interface for anything that matched Dr. Lian's descriptions of the resonance modulators. The control surfaces were minimalist, few buttons or obvious input mechanisms, mostly flat touch panels with abstract symbols that meant nothing to me. I removed the data chip from my identification bracelet and located what appeared to be an input slot on the main console. When I inserted the chip, the interface came to life, displaying a complex diagnostic schematic of the Nanomesh barrier system. A series of prompts appeared, walking me through the precise sequence of adjustments Dr. Lian had prepared. I followed them carefully, making minute changes to values. I didn't fully understand quantum resonance frequencies, oscillation patterns, harmonic interference modulations. With each adjustment, the schematic updated, showing subtle shifts in the barrier visualization. I had no way of knowing if these changes were having any effect in the real world, if the walls were becoming visible to others, or simply changing in ways only I would notice. As I completed the final adjustment, a confirmation prompt appeared. Resonance frequency shift to visible spectrum implementation complete. Barrier visibility now set to universal confirm. I hesitated for just a moment, considering the magnitude of what I was about to do. Then I pressed confirm. The system processed for several seconds. Then, all at once, every screen in the control center changed to show emergency notifications. Warning symbols flashed. Status indicators shifted from green to red across the entire display. And on the monitoring screens showing Division 22, I could see people on the street stopping, pointing, reacting in confusion and alarm to structures that had suddenly become visible to everyone. The walls were no longer invisible. Dr. Lian's plan had worked. Almost immediately, alarms began sounding throughout the complex. An automated voice announced, "Critical system modification detected. Security lockdown initiated. All personnel remain in place for verification." I had perhaps minutes, maybe only seconds, before Civic Harmony officers arrived. Following Dr. Lian's emergency extraction instructions, I moved quickly to a maintenance access panel she had identified in her schematics, located on the east wall of the control center. The panel opened easily, revealing a narrow service tunnel beyond, likely used for maintenance of the complex environmental and security systems. According to Dr. Lian, this tunnel should lead to an emergency exit that would bring me out near the peripheral transportation hub, where I might have a chance to lose myself in the inevitable confusion. As I slipped into the tunnel and pulled the panel closed behind me, I heard the security door to the control center slide open. Heavy footsteps and urgent voices filled the room I had just vacated. I began crawling through the cramped service tunnel as quickly and quietly as possible, navigating by the dim emergency lighting strips embedded in the floor. Behind me, the voices grew more agitated as they discovered the changes I had made to the resonance modulators. Ahead lay uncertainty whether I would escape or be captured. Whether the visibility of the walls would lead to positive change or simply a new form of control. Whether Dr. Lian's plan would ultimately succeed or fail. But one thing was certain: for the first time in 15 years, the citizens of Division 22 could see the invisible infrastructure that had been controlling their lives. The walls were visible to everyone now, and once seen, they could never be unseen. Whether this revelation would lead to liberation or chaos remained to be seen, but the truth was out, exposed to the light, no longer hidden behind the perfect deception of invisibility. And for now, that would have to be enough. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Visible Chaos. The service tunnel seemed to go on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of narrow crawl spaces and junction points that forced me to consult Dr. Lian's mental map at every turn. My knees and palms were raw from crawling, my uniform torn and filthy. But I kept moving forward, driven by the sounds of pursuit that occasionally echoed through the maintenance network. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I reached what Dr. Lian had described as an emergency exit, a simple maintenance hatch that should open into a public utility corridor near the peripheral transportation hub. I pressed my ear against the hatch, listening for any signs of Civic Harmony officers waiting on the other side, but heard nothing except the distant sound of commotion. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the hatch open and cautiously peered out. The utility corridor was deserted, lit by flickering emergency lights rather than the usual steady illumination. Something had disrupted power systems throughout the complex. Perhaps an unintended consequence of my modifications to the nanomesh barriers, I slipped out of the maintenance tunnel and quickly oriented myself according to the directional indicators on the wall. The transportation hub should be approximately 200 meters to my right. I moved swiftly but cautiously, alert for any sign of security personnel. When I reached the end of the utility corridor, I paused at the door leading to the main concourse of the transportation hub. Through the small security window, I could see a scene of unprecedented chaos. Hundreds of citizens milled about in confusion, many pointing and gesturing at the now visible walls that crisscrossed the massive space. The barriers shimmered in the air, their subtle iridescence clearly visible to everyone, now dividing the concourse into distinct sectors that had always been invisibly separated. Civic harmony officers were attempting to maintain order, but they seemed as disoriented as the citizens, repeatedly bumping into barriers they had previously navigated by unconscious habit rather than visual guidance. The carefully controlled flow of human movement that had defined Division 22 for 15 years had collapsed into disorder in a matter of minutes. I quickly assessed my appearance. My gray uniform was disheveled and dirty from the maintenance tunnel, immediately marking me as out of place. I needed a disguise, or at least a way to blend in with the confused crowd. Near the door was a small storage locker for maintenance personnel. Breaking the simple locking mechanism, I found a utility worker's coverall, brown like a level 1 uniform, but without organizational insignia. I quickly pulled it on over my gray uniform and took a maintenance cap to partially obscure my face. Thus disguised, I slipped through the door and into the chaotic concourse, immediately adopting the same confused demeanor as everyone around me. I pointed at the walls, shook my head in disbelief, muttered questions to no one in particular. Just another bewildered citizen confronting the suddenly visible infrastructure of control. "What are they?" a woman in a blue level 4 uniform asked me, gesturing at the shimmering barriers. "I don't know," I replied, feigning the same confusion. "They just appeared a few minutes ago. Can you feel them? They're solid." She reached out tentatively to touch the nearest wall, her expression shifting from confusion to outrage as her fingers met the invisible resistance. "But I've been walking through this area for years. How is this possible?" All around us, similar conversations were taking place as citizens discovered the truth that barriers they had never seen had been controlling their movements throughout the division for years. Some reacted with anger, others with fear, many with simple disbelief. I used the confusion to make my way toward the exit gates, where transport pods were still arriving but not departing. Civic harmony officers were establishing a perimeter, checking identification of anyone attempting to leave the transportation hub. Whatever was happening, they were determined to contain it. My escape route was closing rapidly. I needed a new plan. As I assessed my options, a public announcement system crackled to life, and a calm, authoritative voice spoke over the din of the confused crowd. "Attention, citizens of Division 22. This is Administrator Cow of the Central Harmony Authority. Please remain calm. What you are experiencing is a temporary visual phenomenon resulting from an atmospheric modification test. The apparent barriers you are seeing are simply a harmless optical illusion created by light refraction in the modified atmosphere. They pose no danger and will dissipate within 24 to 48 hours as the atmosphere returns to normal composition." The message repeated 3 times, its reasonable tone and scientific-sounding explanation having a visibly calming effect on many citizens. They wanted to believe there was a rational explanation that their trusted administrators wouldn't have been controlling them through invisible walls for years without their knowledge. "That's nonsense," said a voice behind me. "Those aren't optical illusions. They're solid." I turned to find myself face to face with a man in a gray level 3 uniform similar to my own, though his designation badge identified him as a structural engineering specialist rather than a data reconciliation expert. "You can feel them," he continued, lowering his voice and glancing nervously at the civic harmony officers establishing perimeters around the concourse. "And I've noticed something else. They match exactly with the transit permission boundaries in the civic planning documentation. These walls have been controlling where we can go based on our organizational level." His perception was unusually acute, dangerous in this environment. I glanced at his identification badge. "Specialist Tuan. Be careful who you say that to," I warned him quietly. The official explanation is atmospheric modification. He studied me more carefully, noting my maintenance coverall hastily pulled over a gray uniform. You don't believe that either? Who are you? Before I could answer, a new commotion erupted near the main entrance. A group of brown uniformed Level 1 workers had begun attempting to push through one of the visible walls, a barrier that had apparently always prevented them from accessing the premium transit platforms reserved for Level 4 and above. "It's been here all along," one of them shouted. "They've been keeping us out with invisible walls. This isn't an atmospheric test. It's control." Civic Harmony officers rushed to contain the disturbance, but the crowd's mood was shifting from confusion to anger, as the implications of the visible walls became impossible to ignore. The careful segregation of citizens by organizational level, once hidden behind the perfect deception of invisibility, was now literally transparent. "We need to get out of here," Specialist Tuan said urgently. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." He was right. The Civic Harmony officers were beginning to deploy compliance devices, handheld tools, that delivered a painful but non-lethal neurological disruption to restore civic cooperation. Soon, they would establish complete control over the transportation hub, and anyone without proper identification and purpose would be detained for wellness evaluation. "The maintenance access corridors," I suggested. "Level 3 specialists have service route authorization." Tuan nodded, immediately understanding. We moved casually toward a service door marked "Authorized Maintenance Personnel Only." Carefully timing our approach to avoid the attention of nearby Civic Harmony officers, Tuan placed his identification bracelet against the scanner, and the door unlocked with a soft click. We slipped through, quickly closing it behind us, and found ourselves in a utilitarian corridor used for transportation hub maintenance and service. "You're not maintenance staff," Tuan said once we were safely out of the main concourse. "What's your actual designation?" "Data Reconciliation Specialist Min," I admitted, seeing no reason to lie now that we were temporarily safe. "And I know more about those walls than I should." His eyes widened slightly. "You're connected to what's happening, aren't you?" "To the walls becoming visible?" I hesitated, then nodded once. If I was going to survive the chaos I had unleashed, I would need allies. And something about Specialist Tuan's immediate recognition of the wall's true purpose suggested he might be a valuable one. "I made them visible," I said simply. "They've been there for 15 years, controlling where every citizen can go based on their organizational level. I found a way to shift their resonance frequency into the visible spectrum so everyone could see the cage they've been living in." Instead of the shock or disbelief I expected, Tuan's expression showed something closer to grim satisfaction. "I knew it," he said quietly. "As a structural engineering specialist, I've been analyzing transit patterns and citizen movement flows for years. The data never made sense. People consistently avoided certain pathways that should have been optimal, always took specific routes despite more efficient alternatives being available. I documented dozens of invisible bottlenecks and inexplicable movement constraints. And you reported these findings?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Of course." 3 separate analysis reports submitted to the Civic Infrastructure Database. All were classified, restricted, and I was reassigned to less complex transit pattern analysis. Now I understand why the implications were significant. If other specialists had noticed patterns suggesting invisible control infrastructure, the administration must have been actively suppressing this knowledge for years, systematically silencing anyone who came too close to the truth. "We need to keep moving," I said, suddenly aware that the maintenance corridor would soon be searched. "The entire division is probably on security alert by now." "Where are we going?" Tuan asked. I considered our options. My original extraction plan had depended on using the confusion at the transportation hub to board an outbound transit pod to the residential sectors where I might lose myself in the dense housing complexes. But with the hub locked down and my identity almost certainly flagged in the security system, that route was closed. "We need to find Dr. Leon." I decided. She designed the walls. She'll know what happens next and how to navigate it. "Dr. Leon," Tuan repeated, his expression sharpening with recognition. "Neurospatial architecture, Leon. She disappeared from the public research database about 5 years ago." Most people think she was reassigned to Division 17. She's been hiding in plain sight here in Division 22, I explained as we moved quickly through the service corridor, monitoring the wall system and looking for ways to expose it. She found me because I could see the walls naturally due to a gene therapy side effect. She provided the means to make them visible to everyone. Tuan absorbed this information with remarkable composure. And where do we find her now? The Central Library History section. There's a hidden area behind one of the walls, or at least it was hidden until I made all the walls visible. He frowned. If the walls are visible to everyone now, wouldn't that hidden area be exposed? The Central Authority would immediately secure any unusual spatial anomalies. He was right, Dr. Lian's hiding place would be compromised the moment the walls became visible. She would have evacuated to a secondary location, but where? As we navigated through the service corridors, eventually emerging in a public plaza several blocks from the transportation hub, the full impact of what I had done became apparent. The entire division was in various states of confusion and disorder. Everywhere, citizens were discovering, touching, and attempting to understand the walls that had suddenly appeared in their midst. Some were experimentally testing which walls they could pass through and which ones blocked their passage. Others were gathered in small groups, pointing out patterns in how the barriers divided different areas based on organizational levels. Civic harmony officers were struggling to maintain order, their usual efficient control hampered by the visible infrastructure that had been exposed. Public announcement systems throughout the plaza continuously repeated Administrator Cao's message about temporary visual phenomena. But it was having less effect as citizens directly experienced the solid, selective nature of the barriers. We need to get off the main concourses, Tuan urged, noting the increased presence of civic harmony officers moving through the plaza. They'll be looking for you specifically, and me by association now. The residential sectors. I decided my unit is compromised, but maybe yours isn't yet. Tuan shook his head. Too risky. All Level 3 residential complexes will be under surveillance now. We need neutral territory somewhere between sectors that might be overlooked in the confusion. As we discussed options, my communication device vibrated with an incoming message. I hesitated to check it, knowing that the system could track active devices, but the pattern of vibration matched a specific sequence Dr. Lian had established for emergency contact. I carefully shielded the device from public view and checked the message. Phase 1 successful. Proceed to extraction point beta. Follow the seams. Extraction point. Beta, I murmured, trying to recall if Dr. Lian had mentioned this in our briefing. She hadn't. But the final instruction, follow the seams, suggested a meaning, the walls. I realized, where they join, there are visible seams in the nanomesh. She wants us to follow the intersections of the barriers. Tuan glanced around the plaza, studying the now visible network of walls. That could lead anywhere. How do we know which seams to follow? I considered the problem, then noticed something I hadn't before. Some of the intersections where multiple walls met had a subtle but distinct coloration, slightly bluer than the standard iridescent shimmer of the barriers. There. I pointed discreetly. The blue-tinted intersections. Those must be the markers. We began making our way across the plaza, following the blue-tinted seams where walls intersected. To casual observers, we would appear to be just two more citizens exploring the newly visible barriers. But we were actually following a path Dr. Lian had apparently encoded into the wall system itself, a hidden route visible only to those who knew what to look for. The path led us away from the main administrative and commercial sectors through increasingly less populated areas of Division 22. We passed through residential zones, small manufacturing centers, and finally into what appeared to be a decommissioned agricultural sector, a rare area of open space within the division's otherwise dense urban environment. The agricultural dome had been taken offline years ago when food production was centralized in Division 9, but the basic structure remained a massive, transparent hemisphere covering several hectares of now barren growing beds and empty hydroponic systems. As we followed the final blue-tinted seam to the edge of the agricultural dome, an unassuming maintenance door became visible. Unlike most access points, this door had no electronic lock. Just a simple mechanical handle that clicked open when turned. Beyond lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness with no other options. and civic harmony officers undoubtedly searching for us throughout the division, we began our descent. The staircase led deep underground, far below the standard infrastructure levels of Division 22. The air grew cooler and carried a hint of moisture unusual in the carefully climate-controlled environments of the division. After descending perhaps 30 meters, we reached a heavy metal door with a simple intercom system beside it. Before we could announce ourselves, the door slid open, revealing a surprising sight. A large, well-lit chamber filled with monitoring equipment, data terminals, and walls covered in schematics of Division 22, complete with a nanomesh barrier system now visible to everyone above. In the center of the chamber stood Dr. Lian, but she wasn't alone. At least a dozen other people were present, all working with focused intensity at various stations around the room. Some wore the standard uniforms of different organizational levels, while others were dressed in nondescript clothing without division insignia. "Welcome to Nexus," Dr. Lian said, gesturing us inside. "The only truly wall-free zone in Division 22 and the command center of the Liberation Network." "Hey, you never mentioned a network," I said as the heavy door closed behind us. "You led me to believe you were working alone." Dr. Lian's expression remained impassive. "I told you what you needed to know to complete your task. Too much information would have been dangerous both for you and for us if you had been captured. And now," I gestured to the busy command center around us. "Now you've earned the right to know more," she said simply. "You've accomplished what dozens before you attempted and failed. You've made the walls visible to everyone. Phase 1 is complete." "Phase 1, Tuan repeated, looking around the chamber with keen interest, implying there are additional phases to whatever this operation is. Dr. Lian finally seemed to notice him properly. "You're not part of the original extraction plan. Who is this Min?" "Structural engineering specialist Tuan," I explained. "He recognized the true purpose of the walls immediately and helped me escape the transportation hub. He's been documenting anomalies in citizen movement patterns for years, evidence of the wall system's effects." She studied him with clinical precision, then nodded once. "Another perception anomaly, though, of a different type. You couldn't see the walls, but you could detect their impact on human behavior patterns. Interesting." A young woman in a blue Level 4 uniform approached us, handing Dr. Lian a data tablet. "The division-wide response is intensifying." She reported, "Civic harmony forces are establishing containment perimeters around all major sectors. Administrator Cao has escalated the situation to Stability Level 2 and requested reinforcements from Division 17. "Timeline?" Dr. Lian asked, reviewing the information on the tablet. "Division 17 response units will arrive within 3 hours. Full information containment protocols are already being implemented. They're shutting down all external communications and deploying the official narrative through every available channel." "And the citizens' response?" The woman's expression showed a hint of satisfaction, mixed but trending toward skepticism of the official explanation. "The physical nature of the barriers is impossible to ignore. We're seeing spontaneous testing and documentation in all sectors. Citizen-led mapping initiatives have already begun in residential areas. And our agents, all primary cell leaders, are activated and implementing Phase 2 preparations. We've lost contact with 3 operatives in the administrative sector presumed detained." Dr. Lian absorbed this information with a grim nod, then turned back to us. "You have questions? Ask them quickly. We don't have much time." I had dozens of questions, but started with the most pressing, "What is this place? Who are all these people?" "This is Nexus, the central coordination point for the Liberation Network," Dr. Lian explained. "We're a coalition of citizens from all organizational levels who have in various ways discovered the truth about the wall system and the broader control mechanisms it represents." "How long has this network existed?" Tuan asked. "In its current form, about 7 years. But the resistance began the moment the first walls went up 15 years ago. Originally just a handful of perception anomalies like Min, who could naturally see the barriers. We've grown to include engineers who noticed design inconsistencies, data specialists who identified pattern anomalies, even former civic harmony officers troubled by directives they didn't understand. This explained the diverse group working around us, citizens from every organizational level, united by their awareness of the invisible control system that had been manipulating their society. You said Phase 1 is complete. I noted, making the walls visible was just the beginning. What comes next? Dr. Leon gestured to a large central display showing a real-time map of Division 22, with the wall system now prominently visible. Various sectors were highlighted in different colors, with data streams indicating status reports flowing in from throughout the division. Phase 1 was revelation, making the walls visible so citizens could see the system that has been controlling them. Phase 2 is documentation, capturing indisputable evidence of the wall system's extent and purpose before the administration can implement a cover-up. And Phase 3 is dissolution, actually bringing down the walls both physically and as a system of control. The ambition of this plan was staggering. I had thought making the walls visible was the end goal, allowing citizens to see the truth and react accordingly. But for Dr. Leon and the Liberation Network, it was merely the first step in completely dismantling the control infrastructure of Division 22. The administration will never allow this, I said. They'll create some explanation for the walls, classify them as critical security infrastructure, and punish anyone who questions the narrative. Of course they will, Dr. Leon agreed. They're already doing exactly that. But it won't work, not completely, anymore. The fundamental power of the wall system was its invisibility. Once citizens can see the barriers directly controlling their movements based on organizational level, the perfect illusion of freedom within the system is broken forever. One of the network operatives approached with another update. We're seeing the first organized resistance forming in Residential Sector 7. Level 2 citizens are systematically testing which walls they can and cannot pass through, documenting the results and sharing them through local communication networks. Dr. Leon nodded approvingly. Good. The administration can control official channels, but they can't stop direct observation and local communication. This is exactly the type of organic response we hoped for. I was still struggling to process the scope of what was happening. So you planned for this specific reaction. You anticipated exactly how citizens would respond. We ran hundreds of social behavior simulations, Dr. Leon explained. The most consistent outcome was initial confusion, followed by testing and documentation, followed by organized questioning of the system. Humans naturally resist arbitrary restrictions once they can perceive them directly. Another operative called out from across the chamber. Central Administration is implementing Emergency Protocol 17A. All division communication systems are being rerouted through Central Verification Informational Quarantine, in effect within 15 minutes. They're moving faster than anticipated, Dr. Leon noted with a frown. We need to accelerate Phase 2. She turned to the blue-uniformed woman who had given the first report. Initiate the documentation protocol. All cells should begin public archiving immediately. The woman nodded and moved swiftly to a communication console, sending encoded messages to what I assumed were field operatives throughout the division. What's the documentation protocol? Tuan asked. Our network has prepared comprehensive evidence packages explaining what the walls are when they were implemented and how they've been used to control citizen movements based on organizational level. Dr. Leon explained. We're deploying this information through every available channel before the administration can complete their information lockdown. The urgency in the chamber was palpable now, with operatives working frantically at communication consoles, monitoring stations, and data terminals. The central display showed new alerts appearing across Division 22 as the administration's response intensified. What do you need us to do? I asked, realizing that standing around asking questions wasn't helping the operation. Dr. Leon considered for a moment. Specialist Tuan's structural engineering expertise could be valuable for Phase 3 planning, and your ability to see and interact with the walls in ways others cannot might be critical as we move toward actual dissolution of the barrier system. She led us to a workstation where detailed schematics of the Nanomesh barrier technology were displayed. This is what you made visible today, she explained, indicating the complex quantum-aligned carbon filament structure. But visibility alone doesn't disable the barriers. They're still physically present and functionally active. The schematics showed the remarkable complexity of the wall system, not just simple barriers, but a dynamic responsive network that could selectively permit or deny passage based on individual identification readings, organizational level designations, and real-time authorization parameters. The walls aren't just static barriers. Dr. Lian continued. They're intelligent filters constantly reading citizen identification signals and adjusting permeability based on complex permission matrices. That's why Level 6 administrators can pass through nearly all walls, while Level 1 workers are confined to narrow, pre-approved pathways. And you designed this entire system? I asked, still trying to reconcile the woman before me with the architect of such comprehensive control technology. I designed the basic nanomesh barrier concept, she corrected, a quantum-aligned carbon filament structure that could be selectively permeable. It was meant to be a security enhancement for sensitive facilities, a way to create barriers that would allow authorized personnel through while stopping potential intruders. Her expression darkened. The administration saw its potential for much broader application. They expanded my prototype into a division-wide control system, using it to invisibly enforce the organizational level segregation that had previously been maintained through social conditioning and explicit rules. Perfect control through invisible means. Toan observed, citizens can't resist or question limitations they can't see. Exactly. Dr. Lian agreed. And that's why making the walls visible was so crucial. It transforms unconscious compliance into conscious awareness of restriction. As we discussed the technical aspects of the barrier system, the chamber's alert system suddenly activated red warning lights pulsing along the ceiling as multiple proximity alarms triggered simultaneously. "We have movement in the agricultural sector," reported one of the monitoring specialists. Multiple civic harmony units approaching from all directions. Detection sweep patterns consistent with a targeted search rather than standard patrol. Dr. Lian moved quickly to the central display. Evacuation protocol, Sigma secure, all critical data, and prepare for immediate relocation to alternate sites. The chamber erupted into controlled chaos as operatives quickly secured equipment, transferred data to portable devices, and prepared evacuation routes. The central display shifted to show the positions of civic harmony forces converging on the agricultural dome above us. How did they find this location so quickly? I asked, helping to gather schematics and technical documentation from the workstation. They didn't, Dr. Lian replied grimly. They're conducting systematic searches of all unusual or decommissioned areas in the division. The agricultural dome is an obvious target. It was only a matter of time before they found the access point. Do they know about this underground facility? Unlikely. This level doesn't appear in any official division schematics. It was part of an abandoned waste reclamation project from before the resource allocation crisis. But once they secure the dome, they'll conduct comprehensive scans that will detect this chamber. Tuan was studying the evacuation map that had appeared on a secondary display. These evacuation routes all lead deeper into Division 22. Wouldn't it make more sense to attempt to leave the division entirely? Dr. Lian shook her head. Division boundaries are the most heavily secured areas in the entire system. The walls there are reinforced with conventional security measures, physical barriers, surveillance systems, armed personnel. No. Our best strategy is to disappear into the dense urban environment of the division itself. As the evacuation proceeded, I noticed that the operatives were dividing into small groups, each taking different routes shown on the evacuation map. The Liberation Network was dispersing, transforming from a centralized command center into distributed cells that would be harder to track and eliminate. "You're coming with me," Dr. Lian told us, leading the way to a narrow passage different from the staircase we had used to enter. "We're heading to Secondary Nexus 3 in the manufacturing sector. It's the coordination point for Phase 3 preparations." As we entered the passage, a maintenance tunnel similar to the one I had used to escape the Central Administration Complex, I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since discovering the scope of the Liberation Network. "When you recruited me to make the walls visible, did you know it would lead to this level of division-wide disruption? Was this the plan all along?" Dr. Lian paused briefly, turning to face me in the dim light of the tunnel. "Yes and no. I knew revealing the walls would create significant societal disruption. That was the point. But the specific timing was accelerated. We had planned a more gradual approach with careful preparation of citizen response groups in all sectors before implementation." "What changed?" "Your search queries triggered higher-level security protocols than anticipated. The administration was already closing in on you, and by extension, potentially on us. We had to move immediately or lose our best chance to make the walls visible. This explained the urgency of her approach when we first met the compressed timeline for implementing the plan. What I had perceived as careful strategy had actually been a desperate acceleration of a much more methodical operation. "And now?" Tuan asked as we continued through the maintenance tunnel. "The walls are visible, but the administration still has complete control of division infrastructure, communication systems, and security forces. How does the Liberation Network actually achieve Phase 3, dismantling the walls?" "That," Dr. Leon said with a hint of grim satisfaction, "is where your structural engineering expertise and Min's unique perception abilities become crucial. Because we're not just going to document the walls or explain them to citizens. We're going to bring them down first, figuratively through mass understanding, then literally through technological intervention." The tunnel branched several times as we progressed, with Dr. Leon confidently selecting routes based on some mental map of the maintenance system. Above us, we could occasionally hear the muffled sounds of civic harmony operations, the rhythmic cadence of coordinated search teams moving through the agricultural dome and surrounding areas. After nearly 30 minutes of navigation through increasingly narrow and disused passages, we emerged into a small mechanical room filled with ancient environmental control equipment. Dr. Leon moved directly to what appeared to be a defunct ventilation panel on the far wall, entering a complex sequence on a concealed keypad. The panel slid aside, revealing another passage beyond. "Welcome to Secondary Nexus 3, she said, gesturing us forward. "The brain trust of the Liberation Network, and the place where we'll design the downfall of the wall system." We stepped through into a chamber completely different from the first Nexus, where the original command center had been spacious and filled with monitoring equipment. This was a compact technical workshop crowded with specialized tools, prototype devices, and holographic simulation platforms. Only 5 people were present, all focused on various technical tasks. "Phase 1 complete, Phase 2 in progress," Dr. Leon announced as we entered, "and I've brought resources for Phase 3 implementation." The 5 technicians looked up with varying expressions of surprise and curiosity. Unlike the diverse group at the original Nexus, these individuals all wore the markings of technical specialists, engineers, programmers, and system architects from various organizational levels, united by their opposition to the wall system. "The resonance shift worked perfectly," reported one woman whom I recognized with shock as Senior Design Architect Hao, one of the most prominent infrastructure specialists in Division 22. "The walls are visible to everyone now, but the administration is moving quickly to implement countermeasures. They're already testing resonance dampening in Administrative Sector 1. "Expected," Dr. Leon replied. "They can't restore invisibility completely. That would require division-wide recalibration of the entire Nanomesh system. But they can reduce visibility in priority areas while they formulate their long-term response, which gives us a limited window to implement Phase 3. Added another technician, a young man with the insignia of a Level 5 quantum system specialist. "Once they stabilize the immediate crisis, they'll begin systematic identification and elimination of perception anomalies and network operatives. Then we need to move quickly." Dr. Leon agreed. She turned to us. "Min Specialist Tuan. This is the Phase 3 development team. They've been working for 3 years on the technology to actually dismantle the Nanomesh barrier system." "Dismantle it how?" I asked. "You said the walls were made of quantum-aligned carbon filaments. Wouldn't destroying them require physical intervention throughout the entire division?" "Not destroy," corrected Senior Design Architect Hao. "Reconfigure the Nanomesh system is fundamentally a programmable material guided by quantum resonance fields. If we can access the master control protocols, we can command the entire network to restructure itself." "Into what?" Tuan asked, his engineering background clearly engaged by the technical challenge. "Into whatever we want," said the quantum system specialist with evident pride. "The carbon filaments are an incredibly versatile material. They could be reconfigured into environmental purification networks, structural reinforcement systems, even energy distribution frameworks. The potential applications are endless once they're liberated from their current function as barriers." The ambition of this plan was breathtaking. Not just revealing the walls or dismantling them, but repurposing the entire Nanomesh network for beneficial applications that would serve all citizens regardless of organizational level. But accessing the master control protocols would require physical presence at the Central Harmony Administrative Complex. Again, I pointed out. After what I did, that facility is undoubtedly locked down completely. Dr. Leon smiled thinly. That's the beauty of Phase 1. By making the walls visible to everyone, you force the administration to implement Emergency Protocol 17A, the division-wide information quarantine. And that protocol requires them to activate the Emergency Coordination Network, which is controlled through the same quantum resonance infrastructure as the wall system, added Architect Howe. They're essentially powering up a direct access channel to the very system we want to reconfigure. I was beginning to understand the layers of strategy involved in the Liberation Network's plan. Making the walls visible wasn't just about revealing the truth to citizens. It was a calculated move to force the administration into specific emergency protocols that would create vulnerabilities in their control systems. So, how do we access this Emergency Coordination Network? Tuan asked. That's where your structural engineering expertise becomes valuable, Dr. Leon explained. The network has physical access nodes throughout the division, ostensibly for emergency services coordination, but actually designed as secondary control points for the wall system. Your knowledge of division infrastructure could help us identify the optimal access point. One of the technicians brought up a holographic display of Division 22, highlighting dozens of small nodes distributed throughout the urban environment. These are the emergency coordination terminals. Most are under direct civic harmony observation, but some in peripheral areas might be less heavily monitored during the current crisis. Tuan studied the display with professional interest, his analytical mind clearly processing the distribution pattern. These follow standard emergency response positioning, he noted, but with an unusual concentration in these three sectors. He indicated areas on the northeastern periphery of the division. Maintenance and waste processing, explained Architect Howe. Low population density, minimal strategic importance. They'll be focused on protecting administrative, informational, and transportation infrastructure during the crisis. This node here, Tuan said, indicating a specific point in what appeared to be an industrial waste processing center. It's positioned at a structural junction point, but isn't aligned with any critical systems. It would be considered low priority in standard security protocols. Dr. Leon examined his selection with evident approval. Good analysis. That facility is scheduled for decommissioning next month. Security will be minimal, especially with resources diverted to the current crisis. She turned to the assembled technicians. Prepare the reconfiguration package. We'll attempt access through the waste processing node in Sector 22, NE47. As the team began gathering equipment and preparing what appeared to be specialized access devices, I pulled Dr. Leon aside. You're moving very quickly from revelation to actual reconfiguration of the wall system. Is that wise? Citizens have barely had time to understand what the walls are, let alone consider what should replace them. She studied me with that clinical precision I was coming to recognize as her default analytical mode. The window of opportunity is narrow. Once the administration stabilizes the immediate crisis, they'll implement a comprehensive narrative that reframes the walls as security infrastructure necessary for citizen protection. They'll classify knowledge of the system as a divisional security matter, making discussion of alternatives illegal. We must act before that narrative becomes entrenched. But shouldn't citizens have a voice in what replaces the walls? Isn't unilateral action by the Liberation Network just another form of control from above? This question seemed to give her pause. A fair critique, she acknowledged after a moment. But we're not imposing a new system. We're removing an existing control mechanism. The reconfiguration doesn't create new structures of power. It dismantles them, allowing for truly free movement and association throughout the division for the first time in 15 years. And after that, Tuan joined our conversation. What happens to society when the physical infrastructure of organizational segregation disappears overnight? Disruption, Dr. Leon admitted without hesitation. Confusion, likely some conflict as the established hierarchies struggle to maintain control. Without their invisible enforcement mechanism, but also possibility, the chance for citizens to create new associations based on genuine choice. rather than administered restriction. Her eyes took on a distant quality, as if seeing beyond the immediate crisis to some future state. The walls were always meant to be temporary, a crisis measure that became permanent because it served those in power. Removing them doesn't prescribe what comes next. It simply creates the necessary condition for citizens to determine that collectively. Before we could continue this philosophical discussion, one of the technicians approached with urgency. "We have a problem. Civic Harmony forces have located secondary Nexus 1 and 4. The network is compromised." Dr. Lyon's expression hardened. Casualties. Unknown communications were cut before status reports completed. We have to assume significant network exposure. "Accelerate preparations," she ordered. "We move immediately to the waste processing facility. If other Nexus points are compromised, this location won't remain secure for long." The team moved with practiced efficiency, packing essential equipment into nondescript containers that wouldn't attract attention during transport. Within minutes, they were ready to move. "We'll proceed in 3 separate groups," Dr. Lyon instructed. "Different routes, different timing, converging at the target location. Min and Specialist Tuan will come with me through the maintenance tunnels. The rest of you know your assigned paths." As the others departed through various exits, Dr. Lyon led us to yet another concealed passage, this one hidden behind an environmental control panel. "The administration is moving faster than anticipated," she said as we entered the narrow tunnel. "They've identified more network operatives than our security protocols should have allowed. We may have a breach. Or they've implemented more aggressive perception anomaly detection." I suggested, thinking of how quickly they had noticed my search queries. "Possibly, either way, our timeline is compressed. We need to reach the access node and implement the reconfiguration before they can lock down the emergency coordination network." As we moved through the maintenance tunnel, the complexity of our situation became increasingly clear. What had begun as a mission to reveal the truth had escalated into a race against time, to fundamentally alter the physical infrastructure of Division 22. And if we failed, the administration would not only restore control, but likely implement even more comprehensive surveillance and restriction systems. The walls were visible now, but making them visible had only been the first step in a much larger confrontation. One that would determine whether citizens would continue to live in segregated, controlled environments or have the chance to build something new on the ruins of the invisible barriers that had divided them for so long. As we navigated the dark passages beneath Division 22, I couldn't help wondering what I had set in motion by making that first adjustment to the resonance modulators. Had I helped trigger legitimate liberation, or simply created chaos that would ultimately lead to even stricter control? The answer, I suspected, lay somewhere ahead in the waste processing facility of Sector 22 NE47, and in whatever happened when Dr. Lyon attempted to reconfigure the walls that were now visible to everyone, but still very much in place. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Reconfiguration. The waste processing facility of Sector 22 NE47 was a monument to industrial efficiency, a massive complex of recycling systems, material separation mechanisms, and energy reclamation units that processed the collective refuse of Division 22. Despite its essential function, it was largely automated with minimal human presence required for oversight and maintenance. This combination of critical infrastructure and low personnel density made it an ideal location for our purposes, important enough to have an emergency coordination network node, but not significant enough to warrant priority security during a division-wide crisis. We emerged from the maintenance tunnel into a service area on the facility's eastern perimeter, carefully timing our exit to avoid the automated security sweeps that Dr. Lyon had memorized from the facility's operational protocols. "The network node should be located in the central control hub," she said, consulting a schematic displayed on her portable device. "2 levels up, northwest quadrant. Security presence." I asked, still hyper-aware of my status as the person who had triggered the division-wide crisis. "Minimal under normal circumstances, 2 to 3 civic harmony officers for the entire facility. During the current situation, they've likely been reassigned to higher priority locations." Tuan was studying the layout of the facility with professional interest. The control hub will still have automated security systems even without personnel. Standard protocols would include biometric access restrictions, surveillance coverage, and alarm triggers for unauthorized entry. All manageable with the right preparation. Dr. Lian assured us, removing several small devices from her equipment case. These will temporarily loop surveillance feeds, and this... She held up what appeared to be a thin membrane of translucent material. Will replicate authorized biometric patterns for access panels. She handed each of us a small communication device. We maintain complete silence from this point forward. All coordination through secure channel. Theta 3. If separated, proceed independently to the designated fallback point in Manufacturing Sector 8. With these final instructions, we began moving through the waste processing facility, following a carefully planned route that minimized our exposure to both automated security systems and the few human workers who might still be present. The facility was eerily quiet. The usual industrial processes reduced to minimal operations during the division-wide crisis. Our footsteps echoed faintly against metal walkways as we navigated through massive sorting chambers, recycling systems, and energy reclamation units. What struck me most as we moved was how the now visible walls intersected with the physical infrastructure of the facility. Nanomesh barriers cut through processing equipment control stations and transport systems, with no regard for functional design clearly added after the facility was constructed, creating invisible but very real restrictions on movement within the space. Some areas were accessible only to Level 5 technical specialists. Others limited to maintenance personnel of specific designations. The walls created a complex hierarchy of access that had nothing to do with safety or operational requirements and everything to do with organizational control. Now that they were visible, the arbitrary nature of these restrictions was impossible to ignore. A physical manifestation of the division's rigid hierarchical structure, imposed directly onto industrial infrastructure. As we approached the central control hub, Dr. Lyons signaled for us to stop, indicating a security checkpoint ahead. Through the reinforced glass partition, we could see that the control hub was not in fact unoccupied. 2 Civic Harmony officers stood at alert positions, their stances suggesting heightened security protocols rather than routine oversight. Dr. Lyons' expression tightened. She gestured for us to retreat to a maintenance alcove nearby where we could communicate without risk of detection. "This complicates matters," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The administration must have recognized the strategic importance of the emergency coordination network nodes earlier than anticipated. Can we access a different node?" I asked. She shook her head. "All nodes will be similarly secured by now, and we don't have time to develop a new approach. The administration is already implementing countermeasures against Phase 1. We need to proceed here." Tuan had been studying the control hub layout through the glass partition. "The officers are positioned to monitor the main entrance, but there's a maintenance access point on the southern wall that appears unguarded. It would require climbing through the environmental control system." Dr. Lyon considered this option a tight fit but possible. The access point would bypass the primary security checkpoint, but the inner control room will still have its own security protocols, which your biometric replicator can handle. I confirmed. "Yes, but we'll need to neutralize the officers without triggering facility-wide alarms. They'll have direct communication links to central security." Tuan frowned. "Neutralize how I didn't sign up for violence against Civic Harmony officers. They're just doing their assigned function." "No violence," Dr. Leon assured him, removing a small aerosol device from her equipment case. "This is a specialized neurological sedative, fast-acting, short duration with no lasting effects. It will render them unconscious for approximately 20 minutes without causing harm." I wasn't entirely comfortable with this approach either, but recognized the necessity. We couldn't access the network node with active Civic Harmony officers present. And we couldn't simply ask them to ignore our unauthorized intrusion into a secure facility during a division-wide crisis. "I'll deliver the sedative," Dr. Leon continued. "I need you two to create a distraction that will draw their attention away from the southern access point. Nothing that triggers formal security protocols, just something that requires their momentary attention." Tuan considered the layout of the facility. The waste sorting system on the eastern processing line. If we trigger a minor classification error, it would register as a system anomaly requiring verification but not emergency response. "Perfect." Dr. Lian agreed. You know how to initiate that. Yes. It's a standard procedure in infrastructure maintenance training, how to identify and correct automated sorting errors. With our approach determined, we synchronized our communication devices and separated to execute the plan. Tuan and I moved quickly to the eastern processing line, while Dr. Lian positioned herself near the southern maintenance access point with the sedative device ready. The sorting system was a massive automated mechanism that separated different types of waste materials using a combination of spectroscopic analysis, density detection, and material recognition algorithms. Tuan located a maintenance terminal and quickly accessed the system's diagnostic functions. A simple recalibration of the density detection parameters should create enough anomalous readings to require human verification, he explained as his fingers moved rapidly over the interface. Their sorting errors will begin registering in approximately 30 seconds. We retreated to a concealed position with a clear view of both the sorting system and the control hub. Security checkpoint. As predicted, the system soon began flagging materials for verification, small warning lights activating along the processing line. After about a minute, a notification appeared on the security officer's terminal inside the control hub. They conferred briefly, then one of them moved toward the east exit to investigate the sorting anomaly, while the other remained at the checkpoint. This wasn't what we had hoped for. The distraction was supposed to draw both officers away from their posts. Tuan quickly adjusted his approach, increasing the severity of the sorting errors to require additional verification. More warning lights activated and the sorting system began automatically halting materials that couldn't be properly classified. The remaining officer at the checkpoint received another more urgent notification. After a moment's hesitation, he activated what appeared to be an automated security protocol for the checkpoint and moved to join his colleague at the sorting system. The moment both officers were engaged with the malfunctioning system, Dr. Lian moved swiftly to the southern maintenance access point, a narrow ventilation duct that connected to the environmental control system of the control hub. She disappeared inside just as the officers began running diagnostic procedures on the sorting mechanism. Tuan and I maintained our position, ready to create additional distractions if necessary. Through our communication devices, we could hear Dr. Lian's measured breathing as she navigated the cramped ventilation system. After several tense minutes, her voice came through the secure channel. I'm in position above the inner control room. 2 more officers inside standard patrol configuration, proceeding with sedative deployment. There was a brief silence, then officers neutralized, proceeding to the network node standby. Tuan and I exchanged glances, both relieved and concerned. The plan was working, but we were now committed to a course that would be classified as direct sabotage of division security systems, a far more serious offense than the information access violations I had committed earlier. How are the officers at the sorting system? Dr. Lian asked through the communication channel. I carefully observed their activities. Still engaged with diagnostic procedures, they appear to be attempting a system reset. Good. That should occupy them for several more minutes. I've located the Emergency Coordination Network terminal. Beginning access protocols now. We could do nothing but wait and watch as Dr. Lian worked to access the network node. The officers at the sorting system were becoming visibly frustrated with the persistent malfunctions which Tuan had designed to be increasingly difficult to resolve through standard procedures. I've established primary access to the network, Dr. Lian reported after several minutes. Implementing the reconfiguration package, now estimated completion time, 7 minutes. Just as she delivered this update, a division-wide alert sounded a penetrating tone, followed by an automated announcement. Attention all citizens, this is a division security alert. Unauthorized access to critical infrastructure has been detected. All citizens are directed to return to their assigned residential sectors immediately. Civic harmony forces have been authorized for enhanced compliance measures. This is not a drill. The officers at the sorting system immediately abandoned their diagnostic efforts, activated their communication devices, and began receiving what appeared to be new instructions. The system detected the access attempt, Tuan said urgently. They know someone is trying to modify the network. I relayed this information to Dr. Lian through our secure channel. Expected but not ideal, she replied, her voice tense but controlled. The reconfiguration package is still uploading. I need the full 7 minutes. Keep the officers occupied if possible." The officers were now moving back toward the control hub with clear urgency. We needed to delay them without revealing our presence or triggering additional security responses. Swan quickly returned to the maintenance terminal for the sorting system. I can trigger a more significant malfunction, a full system shutdown that would register as a potential contamination risk. It would require immediate response according to standard protocols. "Do it," I urged, watching as the officers approached the halfway point back to the control hub. Tuan's fingers flew across the terminal, implementing what appeared to be an emergency shutdown sequence. Moments later, alarm lights activated throughout the processing line, and a containment protocol initiated hermetically sealed barriers, dropping to isolate the contaminated section. The automated announcement system activated, warning potential hazardous material containment breach in Eastern Processing Sector. All personnel implement Safety Protocol 12B immediately. The officers stopped, clearly torn between their new instructions and the apparent contamination emergency. After a brief consultation, one continued toward the control hub, while the other returned to address the processing line situation. One officer still approaching the control hub. I warned Dr. Lyon, understood reconfiguration at 68%, continuing the process. The officer moved with increased urgency, now drawing his compliance device as he approached the security checkpoint. He would reach the inner control room within a minute, where he would discover his unconscious colleagues and Dr. Lyon accessing the network node. "We need another distraction," I told Tuan. He shook his head grimly. "I've exhausted the remote options for the processing systems. Anything more would require physical intervention." I made a split-second decision. "Keep monitoring the situation. I'm going to intercept the officer." Before Tuan could protest, I moved quickly from our concealed position, circling around through an adjacent processing area to approach the control hub from a different direction than the officer. I reached the main corridor just as the officer was about to enter the security checkpoint. Adopting the demeanor of a concerned facility technician, I called out to him, "Officer, thank goodness we have a situation in the Western Reclamation Unit. The containment protocols have isolated a technician in a potentially hazardous area." The officer hesitated, clearly conflicted between his current directive and a potential life safety situation. "I have priority instructions to secure the control hub," he said, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "The technician is trapped in a sealed chamber with declining air quality." I insisted, trying to sound appropriately urgent but not suspicious. "The automated system is registering elevated toxicity levels. The control hub can wait 2 minutes. A human life might not..." My appeal to the officer's protective function worked. Despite his orders, he couldn't ignore a direct safety risk to a division citizen. "Show me," he said, following as I led him away from the control hub toward the western section of the facility. "Status update," I whispered into my communication device as we walked. "Reconfiguration at 89%, Dr. Lyon replied. "Almost there. I needed to keep the officer occupied for just a few more minutes." The Western Reclamation Unit was actually fully automated with no human presence. But he wouldn't know that until we arrived and inspected the area, which would take precious time. As we approached the western section, the officer's communication device activated. He paused to listen, then his expression hardened with suspicion. "Control hub reports no life signs in the Western Reclamation Unit," he said, his hand moving to his compliance device. "Identify yourself, citizen." Before I could respond, a new division-wide announcement began, different from the security alert, with a strange, almost melodic quality to the transmission. "Attention all citizens of Division 22 Nanomesh Barrier, reconfiguration in progress. Please remain in your current locations. Temporary visual distortion may occur. Do not be alarmed. This is a planned system adjustment." The message repeated once, then fell silent. The officer looked confused, clearly having received no prior notification of any planned system adjustment. "What's happening?" he demanded, now fully alert and suspicious. "Reconfiguration complete." Dr. Lyon's voice came through my communication device. "Phase 3 initiated. Prepare for barrier dissolution." At that moment, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the facility. The visible walls, the shimmering iridescent barriers that had divided the space according to organizational level permissions, began to change. Their colors shifted from the subtle rainbow hue to a deeper blue, then purple, then a brilliant white. And then, before our eyes, they began to move. The nanomesh barriers seemed to ripple, then flow like liquid, their rigid planar structures dissolving into fluid streams of luminous material that drifted through the air. The walls weren't simply disappearing, they were transforming, restructuring themselves, according to some new organizational principle. The officer watched in stunned disbelief as the barriers that had been solid, impassable boundaries just moments before flowed around and past him like glowing rivers in the air. Throughout the facility, and presumably throughout the entire division, the invisible walls that had controlled citizen movements for 15 years were dissolving their component materials, repurposing themselves into new configurations. My communication device activated again, with Dr. Leon's voice addressing not just me, but apparently all Liberation Network operatives. Phase 3 successful. The reconfiguration package is implementing division-wide. The walls are coming down. The officer finally recovered from his shock and raised his communication device to report, but only static came through the emergency coordination network. The same system we had used to implement the reconfiguration was apparently no longer functioning. "What have you done?" he demanded, training his compliance device on me with a trembling hand. "Created the possibility of choice," I answered simply. For the first time in 15 years, citizens of Division 22 will move through their environment based on their own decisions, not predetermined restrictions. Before he could respond, the flow of reconfigured nanomesh material intensified, forming mesmerizing patterns throughout the facility. The glowing streams began to congregate around environmental systems, waste processing equipment, and energy distribution nodes, integrating with the infrastructure rather than dividing it. Minno. Tuan's voice came urgently through my communication device. "The reconfiguration is working, but it's triggered a division-wide security response. All Civic Harmony forces are being mobilized. We need to evacuate immediately." The officer heard this communication and moved to apprehend me, but at that moment, the lights throughout the facility flickered and went dark. Emergency lighting activated seconds later, casting the space in an eerie red glow. In the confusion, I managed to evade the officer and make my way back toward Tuan's position. We rendezvoused near the eastern exit where Dr. Leon was waiting for us, her expression showing a mixture of triumph and concern. "The reconfiguration was successful," she confirmed as we hurried away from the facility. "The nanomesh barriers are dissolving and reforming throughout the division. But the administration has implemented Emergency Protocol 19 full security lockdown. We need to reach the fallback point in Manufacturing Sector 8 before they establish containment perimeters." As we moved through the industrial outskirts of Division 22, the transformation of the walls was visible everywhere. The barriers that had once divided citizens based on organizational level were dissolving, the nanomesh material flowing like luminous rivers through the urban landscape, gradually coalescing around infrastructure systems, purification units, environmental controls, energy distribution nodes. "What exactly is it doing?" I asked, watching as streams of glowing material integrated with a water purification system we passed. "Exactly what we programmed it to do," Dr. Leon explained as we hurried through increasingly crowded streets. "The nanomesh is reconstructing itself into an augmentation network for critical infrastructure, improving efficiency, removing contaminants, optimizing energy usage. Instead of separating citizens, it's now supporting systems that benefit everyone equally." Citizens were emerging from buildings to witness the extraordinary transformation, their expressions ranging from awe to confusion to fear. The administration's attempts to explain the phenomenon through official channels were clearly failing. This was too significant, too visible, too fundamentally disruptive to be dismissed as a routine system adjustment. We continued moving toward Manufacturing Sector 8, navigating through increasingly crowded streets as citizens abandoned the directive to return to residential sectors in favor of witnessing the unprecedented changes sweeping through the division. "Look," Tuan said, pointing toward a major intersection ahead. "The transit restrictions are gone." He was right. The transit hub that had always invisibly channeled different organizational levels through separate pathways was now open. Citizens in brown Level 1 uniforms were cautiously entering areas that had previously been restricted to Level 4 and above. while blue uniformed administrators stood in visible confusion as their exclusive transit platforms filled with people of all organizational designations. "It's working faster than I anticipated," Dr. Leon observed. "The physical reconfiguration is only part of the process. The social reconfiguration, citizens recognizing their new freedom of movement that's happening organically." But not everyone was embracing the change. As we approached the edge of Manufacturing Sector 8, we encountered the first signs of resistance from the administrative power structure. A contingent of civic harmony officers had established a control point at a major intersection, checking identification and preventing citizens from moving freely between sectors. "The administration is trying to maintain the segregation physically since the walls are gone," Tuan noted as we observed from a distance. "Expected but futile," Dr. Leon replied. "They don't have enough personnel to replace the division-wide barrier system with human enforcement. And every visible restriction they implement now will only highlight the control they've been exercising invisibly for years." We carefully circumvented the control point using service alleys and maintenance corridors, continuing our journey toward the fallback point, a decommissioned manufacturing facility that the Liberation Network had converted into a secondary command center. As we moved through the back areas of Manufacturing Sector 8, my communication device activated with an incoming message on the secure network channel. "Attention all operatives. Central Administration has implemented full division lockdown. Sectors are being physically sealed. External communication has been terminated. Division Defense Forces have been mobilized to support civic harmony operations. Proceed to nearest secure location and await further instructions." Dr. Leon's expression grew grave. "They're escalating beyond standard containment protocols. Division Defense Forces are military-level security. They haven't been deployed within the division since the resource allocation crisis 15 years ago. When the walls first went up, I noted seeing the historical connection." "Exactly. The administration is treating the dissolution of the walls as a crisis equivalent to the one that justified their creation, a fundamental threat to divisional stability." "Are they wrong?" Tuan asked quietly. "Look around us. The entire social order of Division 22 was built on those invisible barriers. Without them, the organizational level system has no physical enforcement mechanism." "That's precisely the point," Dr. Leon replied. "Citizens should be organized by choice and function, not controlled by invisible barriers they never consented to. Yes, there will be disruption as the system adjusts, but that's the necessary price of transitioning from controlled segregation to genuine choice." As we continued toward the fallback point, the sounds of the growing crisis became more pronounced. Announcement systems broadcasting security directives, the movement of enforcement vehicles through main thoroughfares, occasional disturbances as citizens resisted new physical restrictions. We were witnessing the beginning of a fundamental power struggle, the administrative structure fighting to maintain control as the physical infrastructure of that control dissolved around them. There, Dr. Leon pointed to an unassuming building ahead, a former manufacturing facility for environmental system components officially decommissioned 5 years earlier, but secretly repurposed by the Liberation Network, the fallback point. "We should find the rest of the Phase 3 team there, along with network communication equipment." As we approached the building, however, something felt wrong. The perimeter showed no signs of the subtle security measures the network typically employed. The access door that should have been secured with a specialized recognition system stood slightly ajar. "Wait," I whispered instinctively, pulling back. "Something's not right." Dr. Leon froze her experienced eyes, scanning the facility with sudden suspicion. "No signal lights," she noted, referring to the disguised indicators that network locations used to signal their security status. "And no perimeter monitoring alerts on our approach." Tuan pointed to a nearly invisible detail, a small surveillance device positioned above the access door, its design inconsistent with Liberation Network equipment. "That's a Civic Harmony portable monitoring unit. This location has been compromised." Dr. Lyon's expression hardened. "Fall back immediately. Standard dispersal protocol. Alternative rendezvous point." Delta. We retreated quickly and silently, using the industrial clutter of the manufacturing sector as cover. Once safely distant from the compromised fallback point, Dr. Leon activated her secure communication device, sending a coded warning to all network operatives about the location. How did they find it so quickly? I asked as we moved through the increasingly chaotic division toward our alternative destination. The same way they located the nexus points. Dr. Leon replied grimly. Either they've developed more sophisticated methods for tracking perception anomalies and network communications, or there's a breach in the network, Tuan finished. Someone providing inside information. The implications were disturbing. The Liberation Network had operated in secret for years, carefully vetting members and maintaining strict security protocols. If those protocols had been compromised, the entire operation and everyone involved was at risk. Alternative Rendezvous Point Delta is in Residential Sector 12, Dr. Leon explained, as we navigated through increasingly crowded streets. A Level 3 residential unit converted for network operations will regroup there and assess the situation. As we moved through Division 22, the full impact of the wall dissolution became increasingly apparent. Citizens of all organizational levels were mingling in public spaces that had previously been invisibly segregated. Transit systems, designed to channel different levels through separate routes, were now functioning as genuinely public transportation accessible to everyone. But alongside this spontaneous integration, the administration's response was intensifying. Civic harmony officers were establishing physical checkpoints at key intersections, attempting to manually enforce the segregation that the walls had maintained invisibly. Announcement systems continuously broadcast directives for citizens to return to their designated sectors, though compliance appeared inconsistent at best. Most concerning were the armored vehicles now visible on major thoroughfares, Division Defense Forces deploying throughout the urban environment in a show of authority not seen in 15 years. The administration is implementing Crisis Response Protocol 5, Dr. Leon observed as we witnessed a contingent of defense forces establishing a perimeter around a major administrative building. Full physical security deployment to maintain organizational level segregation. They're trying to replace the wall system with human enforcement. But they can't possibly cover the entire division, Tuan pointed out. There were thousands of invisible walls creating a comprehensive segregation system at every scale, from major sectors down to individual rooms in some facilities. Exactly, Dr. Leon agreed. They'll prioritize administrative centers, information repositories, and key infrastructure. Residential and manufacturing areas will have minimal coverage, which creates space for citizen organization outside administrative control. As we carefully made our way toward Residential Sector 12, avoiding main thoroughfares and security checkpoints, we witnessed numerous instances of spontaneous reorganization as citizens adapted to the absence of the walls. Impromptu community gatherings formed in public spaces that had previously been restricted. Citizens of different organizational levels engaged in direct conversation, many for the first time, but not all interactions were positive. We also observed confrontations between citizens of different levels, particularly Level 5 and above, attempting to maintain their privileged access to certain areas, despite the absence of physical barriers, and Level 1 and 2 workers asserting their right to enter previously restricted spaces. The social walls remain, even as the physical ones dissolve, Tuan noted as we watched a tense exchange between a blue-uniformed administrator and several brown-uniformed workers attempting to enter a previously restricted commercial area. Expected and necessary. Dr. Leon replied, 15 years of invisible segregation created deeply internalized boundaries. Citizens need to negotiate new social contracts now that the physical enforcement is gone. There will be conflict in that process. It's unavoidable. We finally reached Residential Sector 12, a densely populated area, primarily housing Level 3 specialists and technicians. The effects of the wall dissolution were less immediately apparent here, as residential sectors had always been organized by organizational level with relatively little invisible segregation within them. The alternative rendezvous point was located in a standard residential tower, indistinguishable from dozens of others in the sector. Dr. Leon led us to a service entrance where she entered a complex access code on a disguised panel. The door unlocked with a soft click, allowing us entry to a service corridor that connected to the main residential levels. Residential Unit 1247-386, she instructed as we navigated through the building. Standard approach protocols separated arrival interval timing, full authentication required. We proceeded as directed, with Tuan entering the residential level first, followed by me 5 minutes later, and Dr. Lian after another interval. This staggered approach was designed to prevent multiple network operatives from being identified together, a precaution that seemed particularly important now that several network locations had been compromised. When I reached Residential Unit 1247-386, I found what appeared to be a standard Level 3 housing assignment. The same basic layout as thousands of other units throughout the division, I activated the visitor notification system according to the authentication protocol Dr. Leon had specified. After a moment, the door opened to reveal not the network operatives we expected, but a single elderly man in a simple gray jumpsuit without organizational insignia. He gestured for me to enter quickly, checking the corridor before securing the door behind me. Inside, the residential unit had been converted into a communication center with multiple data terminals monitoring systems and what appeared to be specialized network equipment, concealed within standard residential furnishings. Tuan was already present, examining one of the data displays with evident concern. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," he reported as I joined him. "The administration has implemented full divisional isolation, all external transit suspended, communication channels restricted to administrative frequencies only. Where are the other network operatives?" I asked the elderly man who was monitoring a complex display of security feeds from throughout the division. "Scattered or captured?" He replied grimly. "Civic Harmony forces have identified and raided 17 network locations in the past 3 hours. We've lost contact with over 40% of our operatives." Derleon arrived minutes later, immediately moving to the central communication terminal. "Status report." She demanded. "Phase 3 implementation is complete." The elderly man who introduced himself as Coordinator Feng, one of the original Liberation Network founders, reported, "The Nanomesh barrier reconfiguration is proceeding as designed throughout the division. Approximate completion time for full integration with infrastructure systems, 4 hours." And the administration's response? More aggressive than anticipated. They've mobilized the entire division defense force, implemented full physical security protocols at all critical infrastructure, and initiated a systematic identification and detention operation targeting suspected network operatives. Dr. Leon absorbed this information with a tight expression. "How are they identifying network operatives so efficiently? Our security protocols should have prevented this level of exposure." Coordinator Feng's expression darkened. "The evidence suggests a high-level breach, someone with access to network identification protocols and location data. We're implementing emergency isolation procedures for all remaining cells, but the damage is substantial." "And the citizens' response to the wall dissolution?" I asked, returning to what seemed most important, whether our actions had created the possibility for genuine change or merely triggered administrative crackdown. Feng activated a display showing feeds from throughout Division 22. Mixed and evolving in residential and commercial sectors, we're seeing widespread integration of organizational levels, with citizens largely embracing the freedom of movement. In administrative and information sectors, the physical security presence is maintaining segregation through conventional enforcement. The display showed scenes that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Level 1 workers freely accessing recreational areas previously reserved for Level 4 and above. Mixed groups of citizens from all organizational levels gathering in public spaces. Spontaneous community assemblies forming in areas that had been segmented by invisible barriers. But it also showed the counter-response Civic Harmony officers establishing checkpoints and verification stations. Division defense forces securing key facilities with physical barriers and armed personnel. Citizens being detained for attempting to access areas inappropriate to their organizational designation. The administration can't maintain physical enforcement indefinitely, Dr. Leon observed. They don't have the personnel resources to replace the comprehensive barrier system. This level of deployment is crisis response, not sustainable control. Perhaps Coordinator Feng agreed, but they don't need to control the entire division, just the critical nodes of power and information. If they secure administrative centers, data repositories, and key infrastructure, they can establish a new equilibrium without the walls, but with conventional control mechanisms. As we assessed the rapidly evolving situation, an urgent alert sounded from the communication system. Feng quickly accessed the incoming transmission, a coded message from a network operative embedded in the central administration complex. Administrator Cao has authorized implementation protocol 23A. He reported, his expression grave. They're preparing to deploy aerial sedative distribution throughout residential and commercial sectors. Mass sedation, I asked, stunned by the escalation. They're going to chemically subdue the entire civilian population. Not lethal, but effectively incapacitating, Dr. Leon explained. It's an emergency protocol developed during the resource allocation crisis, but never actually implemented aerosolized neurological suppressants distributed through environmental control systems, rendering citizens compliant and minimally conscious for up to 12 hours, during which time they could restore physical security measures, identify and detain network operatives, and essentially reset the entire situation. Tuan concluded, grasping the strategic implications immediately. Exactly. Coordinator Feng confirmed, if they succeed, they'll wake a sedated population to a division where the walls are gone, but have been replaced by comprehensive physical security measures, and with the network leadership eliminated. The severity of this development was clear. The administration had moved beyond conventional security responses to chemical incapacitation of civilians. A dramatic escalation that revealed just how threatening they considered the wall dissolution to be. Can we stop it? I asked. Dr. Leon and Coordinator Feng exchanged glances. Possibly, she said. The aerosol distribution system uses the same environmental control infrastructure that the reconfigured Nanomesh is integrating with. If we can accelerate the integration process and gain control of those systems before the sedative deployment begins. How long until deployment? Tuan asked. According to the transmission, approximately 90 minutes. Feng reported they need to secure essential personnel with protective equipment and evacuate key facilities before releasing the aerosol. And how long to accelerate the nanomesh integration with environmental systems? Dr. Leon accessed one of the specialized terminals, rapidly analyzing the reconfiguration progress. The process is at 62% completion currently, with estimated full integration in 4 hours. To accelerate to completion within 90 minutes would require direct access to the Central Environmental Control Hub to modify the integration parameters, which is located in Administrative Sector 1. Feng added, the most heavily secured area of the division at this point. We were facing an impossible dilemma. The only way to prevent mass sedation of the population was to access a facility that was undoubtedly under the highest security the administration could implement. Yet failing to do so would mean surrender the effective end of the liberation movement, just as it had achieved its primary objective. There might be another approach, Tuan suggested after studying the environmental system schematics displayed on one of the terminals. The central hub controls the division-wide system, but there are sector-level environmental substations that manage distribution within their designated areas. If we could access enough of these substations, we might be able to block the aerosol distribution in key residential sectors. Dr. Leon considered this alternative. We'd need to secure at least 5 substations to protect the primary residential population centers, and we'd need to do it simultaneously before the administration realizes what we're attempting. We have 14 operational cells remaining in accessible sectors, Coordinator Feng reported after checking the network status display. Enough to target the substations while maintaining our communication coordination. But this would only protect some sectors, I pointed out. Others would still be affected by the sedative deployment. Partial protection is better than none, Dr. Lin replied grimly. We focus on high-density residential sectors, where the potential for citizen organization is strongest. Administrative and manufacturing sectors are already under physical control. The sedative deployment there is redundant. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the only viable option given our resources and the compressed timeline. Coordinator Feng immediately began transmitting encrypted instructions to the remaining network cells coordinating the simultaneous operation to secure environmental substations in key residential sectors. What about us, I asked. Which substation do we target? Dr. Leon studied the division map displayed on the main terminal. Residential Sector 9 substation. It controls environmental systems for the highest density population center in the division. Over 200,000 citizens. If we can only protect one sector, that's the priority. Civic Harmony forces will be monitoring all infrastructure facilities, especially environmental control systems. Tuan warned, the substations will be secured. Yes, but with distributed forces rather than concentrated security, Dr. Leon countered. The administration's resources are stretched thin, attempting to physically control a division designed to be managed through invisible walls. We'll have a small window of opportunity while they focus on the central hub and preparing essential personnel for the sedative deployment. As Coordinator Feng continued coordinating the synchronized operation across all remaining network cells, Dr. Lian gathered the specialized equipment we would need to access and override the environmental substation controls. This operation has significantly higher risk than previous phases, she acknowledged as she prepared. We're moving from covert system modification to direct confrontation with security forces. The potential for violent response is substantial. Are we crossing a line? I asked quietly. From liberation to insurrection. Dr. Lian paused in her preparations, considering the question seriously. The administration crossed that line when they authorized chemical sedation of civilians as a control measure. We're not initiating violence. We're protecting citizens from an unprecedented violation of basic rights. Tuan had been studying the environmental system schematics with his engineer's precision. I've identified the optimal access route to the Sector 9 substation, he reported. A maintenance tunnel connects this residential complex to the utility infrastructure beneath the sector. From there, we can reach the substation through secondary service corridors with minimal exposure. Good, Dr. Lian approved. We move in 15 minutes. Standard approach, protocol staggered, timing, separate routes converging at the target location. As we made final preparations, I found myself contemplating how rapidly the situation had evolved. Just days ago, I had been a Level 3 data reconciliation specialist, discovering the walls for the first time. Now I was actively participating in a coordinated operation to prevent division-wide chemical sedation of the civilian population. The invisible walls had come down, but the true barriers, the administrative power structures that had implemented and maintained them, were responding with increasingly direct and dangerous methods of control. Synchronizing operation timeline. Coordinator Feng announced communicating with all network cells simultaneously. Substation access will commence in exactly 47 minutes. Priority objective: disable aerosol distribution systems without triggering central monitoring alerts. Secondary objective: establish local environmental control independent from central hub. With our timeline set, we departed the residential unit using the same staggered approach protocol that had brought us there. Tuan left first, following his plotted route to the maintenance access point. I followed 7 minutes later, taking a different path to avoid any pattern that security algorithms might detect. Dr. Lian would depart last after final coordination with Feng. The streets of residential Sector 12 showed the evolving impact of the wall dissolution. Citizens moved with a mix of newfound freedom and visible uncertainty, exploring areas that had previously been inaccessible to them, while casting nervous glances at the increased security presence. Civic Harmony announcements continued to broadcast now with a distinctly urgent tone. Attention all citizens. A division security emergency has been declared. For your safety, return to your designated residential units immediately. Compliance is mandatory. Emergency medical protocols will be implemented within the hour. Remain in your residential units to receive necessary treatment. The necessary treatment euphemism wasn't fooling everyone. I observed citizens hurrying not toward residential units, but away from them, seeking alternatives to the treatment being promised. Others were sealing doors and windows, improvising barriers against whatever might come through environmental systems. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through the Liberation Network's information distribution, perhaps through simple deduction that the administration was planning something beyond conventional security measures. I reached the maintenance access point. Tuan had identified an unassuming utility door in a service alley between residential complexes. Using the access codes he had provided, I entered the maintenance tunnel system that ran beneath the residential sectors, connecting the various infrastructure systems that supported division operations. The tunnels were dimly lit, and clearly seldom visited, with dust undisturbed on much of the equipment. I navigated carefully using the route map Tuan had prepared, conscious that any wrong turn could lead to areas monitored by security systems. After approximately 15 minutes of cautious progress, I reached the designated junction point where our separate routes would converge. Tuan was already there, configuring what appeared to be specialized equipment designed to interface with environmental control systems. "Any complications?" he asked quietly as I joined him. "None." The security focus is clearly on public areas rather than maintenance infrastructure. Logical but short-sighted, he noted. They're prioritizing visible control over system security that works with humans, but not with distributed technical systems. Dr. Lyon arrived precisely on schedule, carrying additional equipment in a standard maintenance case. Status report from Coordinator Feng, she said without preamble. 10 substations now have network operatives in position. 3 teams encountered security and are attempting alternate approaches. 1 substation has been secured and systems accessed. Timeline for sedative deployment. I asked. Accelerated administration appears to have detected our operation. Estimated deployment now in 38 minutes. The urgency of our mission intensified. We proceeded immediately through the maintenance tunnels toward the Sector 9 environmental substation, moving more quickly now despite the increased risk of detection. As we approached the substation access point, Dr. Lian deployed a specialized detection device that scanned for security systems and personnel, 2 Civic Harmony officers stationed at the main entrance. She reported standard patrol pattern. Secondary access through the water reclamation connection appears unmonitored. We adjusted our approach accordingly, utilizing a narrow service passage that connected the main maintenance tunnel to the water reclamation system adjacent to the environmental controls. The passage was barely large enough for one person to navigate at a time, forcing us to proceed in single file with our equipment carefully balanced. Eventually, we emerged into the water reclamation facility, a largely automated system that purified and recycled water throughout the residential sector. From there, an internal access corridor connected directly to the environmental substation. "Wait," Tuan whispered. As we prepared to enter this final corridor, "Security scan first, Doctor." Lian deployed her detection device again, scanning the corridor ahead. "Clear of personnel, but there's an automated surveillance system, standard motion detection, and identification verification. Can we bypass it?" I asked. She nodded, removing a small device from her equipment case. "Localized EM pulse. It will temporarily disable surveillance in the corridor without triggering central security alerts. We'll have approximately 90 seconds to reach the substation control room before secondary systems activate." With the device prepared, Dr. Lian activated the pulse. A soft humming sound emanated briefly, and the status indicators on the surveillance equipment in the corridor went dark. We moved immediately, hurrying along the corridor toward the environmental control room at its end. The substation itself was a compact but comprehensive facility, a control hub for the environmental systems that regulated air quality, temperature, pressure, and composition throughout residential Sector 9. Under normal circumstances, it operated largely autonomously with minimal human oversight required. The control room was unoccupied as expected during standard operations. Dr. Lin immediately connected her specialized equipment to the main system interface while Tuan accessed the distribution controls, and I secured the entry points. Accessing primary environmental protocols, Dr. Lian reported as her fingers moved rapidly across the interface. Locating aerosol distribution parameters. Their chemical disbursement system prepped for activation. Central hub has already loaded the protocol. "Can you disable it?" I asked urgently. "Not without triggering immediate security alerts," she replied, studying the system architecture. "But I can modify the distribution parameters, reconfigure the system to neutralize the sedative compounds before they enter residential circulation." "How long will that take?" "Approximately 12 minutes to implement across all sector distribution nodes." "We may not have 12 minutes," Tuan warned, monitoring the security feeds he had accessed through a secondary terminal. "Civic Harmony forces are implementing a systematic check of all infrastructure facilities. They'll reach this substation within 15 minutes at their current patrol pattern." Dr. Lyon's expression remained focused as she worked. "I need at least 8 minutes to implement the critical modifications. After that, the system will continue the reconfiguration automatically, even if we're forced to evacuate." "I'll secure the corridor," I decided. "Create an early warning system for approaching security forces." Using the limited tools available, I established a simple but effective alert mechanism at both ends of the access corridor. Pressure-sensitive plates that would trigger a silent notification to our communication devices if anyone approached. Returning to the control room, I found Dr. Lian deep in concentration as she implemented the complex modifications to the environmental distribution system, while Tuan monitored both security feeds and system responses. Status update from Coordinator Feng. Tuan reported checking the secure communication channel. 7 substations successfully accessed and modifications in progress. 3. Failed security presence, 2 heavy, 1 undetermined. 7 substations would protect approximately 60% of the residential population. Dr. Lian noted without looking up from her work. Not ideal, but significant. The Nanomesh reconfiguration is continuing throughout the division. Tuan added checking another data feed. Integration with infrastructure systems at 74% completion. Some unexpected adaptations occurring in areas with highest concentration. What kind of adaptations, I asked. The Nanomesh appears to be developing more complex integration patterns than originally programmed. In some locations, it's creating interconnected networks between previously isolated systems, power distribution linking directly with environmental controls, for example. Emergent behavior, Dr. Lian murmured momentarily, glancing up from her work. The quantum properties of the Nanomesh allow for adaptive reconfiguration based on system needs. It's learning as it integrates. This development was both fascinating and concerning. The Nanomesh barrier system had been designed as a control mechanism, but in its reconfigured state, it was demonstrating capabilities beyond its original programming, evolving to improve the infrastructure it was integrating with. Before we could discuss the implications further, my communication device vibrated with the alert I had established security forces approaching from the main corridor. We have company. I warned Civic Harmony Patrol approaching from the main access point. Estimated arrival in 2 minutes. I need 3 more minutes to complete the critical modifications. Dr. Lian set her fingers moving even more rapidly across the interface. I'll delay them. Tuan decided, moving quickly to the corridor. I can implement a level 4 maintenance protocol that would temporarily seal the corridor for environmental calibration. It won't stop them, but it will slow their approach. As Tuan worked to delay the approaching security forces, I monitored the external feeds showing the division-wide situation. The administration's response was intensifying, with Civic Harmony forces establishing physical control throughout all sectors, and the first signs of the Division Defense Force deploying specialized equipment for the planned sedative distribution. At the same time, citizens were responding to the dissolution of the walls in increasingly organized ways. Spontaneous community assemblies had formed in multiple sectors, with representatives from all organizational levels engaging in direct dialogue. Something that had been effectively impossible under the invisible segregation system. Most notably, these assemblies were beginning to coordinate across sectors, sharing information and resources in defiance of the administration's directives to return to designated residential areas. The artificial divisions that had been maintained by the invisible walls were breaking down, not just physically, but socially, as citizens discovered their shared interests transcended organizational level designations. Modification complete. Dr. Lian announced finally the environmental system will neutralize the sedative compounds before distribution. Even if they activate the protocol from the central hub, it won't affect citizens in this sector. Security forces have bypassed the maintenance protocol, Tuan reported as he returned to the control room. They'll reach this location in approximately 60 seconds. We need to evacuate. Dr. Lian decided, quickly disconnecting her equipment. The modifications will continue automatically. Our presence here is no longer necessary and would only result in capture. We gathered our essential equipment and moved quickly toward the secondary exit through the water reclamation facility. Behind us, we could hear the Civic Harmony officers entering the main corridor, their standardized movement patterns echoing against the metal surfaces. Just as we reached the narrow service passage that would lead us back to the maintenance tunnels, a division-wide alert sounded, a distinctive 3-tone signal, followed by an automated announcement. Emergency Protocol 23A activated. All citizens remain in current locations. Environmental purification sequence initiating. Compliance is mandatory. They had begun the sedative deployment perhaps earlier than planned due to detection of our substation operations. Now the effectiveness of our modifications would be tested, determining whether citizens in residential Sector 9 remained conscious, while others throughout the division were chemically subdued. We navigated the service passage as quickly as possible, emerging into the main maintenance tunnel system just as the environmental systems throughout the division hummed with increased activity, the aerosol distribution beginning. "We need to reach a monitoring position," Dr. Leon said urgently. "Somewhere we can observe the effects in both modified and unmodified sectors." "The boundary between Sectors 9 and 10, Tuan suggested. Sector 9 has our modifications, Sector 10 doesn't. We can observe both from the transitional zone." We moved through the maintenance tunnels toward the sector boundary, eventually emerging through a utility access point into a public plaza that straddled the division between the two residential sectors. From this vantage point, we could observe the effects of the sedative deployment in both areas. The results were immediately apparent. In Sector 10, citizens were collapsing where they stood, first showing signs of disorientation, then motor impairment, and finally, unconsciousness. Civic Harmony officers wearing protective respiratory equipment moved efficiently through the affected areas, identifying and detaining specific individuals before they fully succumbed to the sedative effects. But in Sector 9, our modifications were working. Citizens showed momentary confusion as the environmental systems distributed the neutralized compounds, but remained conscious and alert. Many were sealing windows and doors, improvising protective measures against what they correctly perceived as an atmospheric threat. "It worked," I said, watching the stark contrast between the two sectors. "We've protected Sector 9. And the other modified substations appear to be equally effective," Dr. Leon confirmed, checking updates from the network's secure communication channel. "Approximately 58% of the residential population remains unaffected by the sedative deployment. But the rest?" Tuan asked, watching as more citizens collapsed in Sector 10 will be unconscious for approximately 12 hours. Dr. Leon replied grimly, "During which time the administration will implement comprehensive physical security measures, detain network operatives, and attempt to restore control through conventional means. So we've won a partial victory at best," I concluded. "Nearly half the division's population will wake to a new form of control, replacing the old one." "Not necessarily," Dr. Leon said, her expression thoughtful as she monitored data on her portable device. "The Nanomesh reconfiguration is continuing throughout the division, integrating with infrastructure at an accelerating rate. And something unexpected is happening in the sectors where citizens remain conscious." She showed us the data feed from her device, a real-time visualization of the Nanomesh integration across Division 22. In the sectors where citizens had been sedated, the integration was proceeding according to the programmed parameters, with the Nanomesh enhancing existing infrastructure systems. But in the sectors where citizens remained conscious, particularly in Sector 9, the integration pattern was evolving differently. The nanomesh was forming more complex structures, creating interconnections between previously isolated systems and responding to the active human presence in ways we hadn't anticipated. "The nanomesh is adaptive," Dr. Leon explained. "Its quantum properties allow it to respond to both programmed directives and environmental feedback. In areas with active human engagement, it's developing more sophisticated integration patterns, essentially evolving in response to citizen needs rather than just system parameters." Tuan studied the visualization with his engineer's precision. "It's creating a responsive infrastructure network. Environmental systems linking directly with communication channels, power distribution optimizing based on actual usage patterns, even security systems reconfiguring to enable rather than restrict movement. A self-organizing system emerging from the interaction between the reconfigured nanomesh and conscious human activity," Dr. Leon confirmed, exactly the opposite of the control mechanism the walls were designed to be. As we watched this remarkable evolution unfolding across the protected sectors, my communication device activated with an urgent message from Coordinator Feng's Central Administration implementing division separation protocol. Physical barriers being established between affected and unaffected sectors. They're attempting to isolate the areas where citizens remain conscious. This development marked a significant escalation in the administration's response, physically segregating the division based on which sectors had been protected from the sedative deployment. They were creating visible walls to replace the invisible ones we had dissolved. "They're afraid, Ducky," Dr. Lian observed, the combination of conscious citizens and evolving nanomesh infrastructure represents a fundamental threat to centralized control. They're trying to contain it through conventional barriers. But the nanomesh doesn't recognize these artificial divisions. Tuan pointed out, studying the integration visualization, it's creating connections that bypass the physical barriers linking infrastructure systems across sector boundaries, regardless of the administration's attempts at separation. He was right. The evolving nanomesh network was ignoring the administrative boundaries of sectors, creating functional connections based on system efficiency and actual usage patterns rather than imposed divisions. Environmental systems in Sector 9 were linking with power distribution in Sector 8. Communication infrastructure in Sector 12 was connecting with data processing in Sector 11 and 11. The invisible walls that had once divided the division were being replaced not just by their visible absence, but by an actively connective infrastructure that bound different areas together in ways the administration could not easily control. We need to support this evolution. Dr. Lian decided to accelerate the integration in the conscious sectors while establishing connections to the sedated areas. When those citizens wake, they should find themselves part of the new network, not isolated behind the administration's physical barriers. How do we do that? I asked. The administration controls all official communication and transportation systems, but not the nanomesh, she replied. Not anymore. It's responding to citizen activity and system needs rather than centralized directives. We can guide its evolution by creating the right patterns of usage and infrastructure engagement. Tuan immediately grasped the approach. If we establish specific activity nodes in the conscious sector's points of high citizen engagement with infrastructure systems, we could create integration templates that the nanomesh would propagate across boundaries into the sedated sectors. Exactly, Dr. Lian confirmed. Community coordination centers in each conscious sector actively engaging with environmental communication and energy systems in patterns that promote cross-sector integration rather than isolation. It was an elegant solution working with the emergent behavior of the reconfigured nanomesh. Rather than attempting to override the administration's physical control measures directly, the network operatives in the protected sectors could coordinate this approach, I suggested. Establish the integration nodes and guide citizen engagement to reinforce the patterns. Dr. Lian nodded in agreement. I'll contact Coordinator Feng to implement the coordination strategy immediately. We have approximately 10 hours before the sedative effects wear off, time to establish a robust integration pattern that will be difficult for the administration to dismantle. As she composed the detailed instructions for the remaining network cells, I observed the contrast between the two adjacent sectors from our vantage point in Sector 10. Civic Harmony officers moved methodically through streets of unconscious citizens, identifying and detaining specific individuals according to some predetermined list. The physical barriers being established at the sector boundary were substantial, not makeshift blockades, but permanent structures designed for long-term division. In Sector 9, by contrast, citizens were self-organizing in response to the threat, establishing community monitoring points, sharing resources and information, and actively engaging with the evolving infrastructure as the nanomesh created new connections between systems. The division was literally dividing before our eyes, not along the invisible lines of the original walls, but between areas where citizens remained conscious and actively participated in shaping their environment, and those where they had been rendered passive while control systems were imposed around them. This is the real battle now, I realized aloud, not between the Liberation Network and the administration, but between two fundamentally different models of society. One based on conscious participation and emergent order, the other on centralized control and imposed separation. Yes, Dr. Lian agreed, looking up from her communications. And the outcome will depend largely on what happens when the sedated citizens wake. Will they accept the new physical barriers and increase security, or will they recognize the alternative developing in the protected sectors? We need to ensure they can see the difference, Tuan said. The physical barriers the administration is establishing should be transparent, allowing citizens on both sides to observe the contrast between the models. This insight inspired a new approach in Dr. Lian's coordination instructions. The integration nodes would be established specifically at sector boundaries, creating visible evidence of the benefits of the emergent infrastructure system for citizens in the sedated sectors to observe when they regained consciousness. As we finalized this strategy, my communication device activated with a priority alert from the network's monitoring system. The message was brief but alarming. Division Defense Force deploying specialized equipment at Central Administration Complex. Energy signatures consistent with quantum resonance disruption technology. Potential attempt to forcibly reverse Nanomesh reconfiguration in progress. The administration was implementing a technological countermeasure attempting to disrupt the quantum properties of the reconfigured nanomesh and potentially revert it to its original barrier function. They're trying to restore the walls, Dr. Leon said, her expression grave, using experimental quantum disruption to reset the nanomesh frequency patterns to their original configuration. Can they succeed? I asked. Theoretically, yes. The nanomesh remains fundamentally the same material, just operating at different quantum resonance frequencies. If they can generate a powerful enough disruption field calibrated to the original frequency patterns, they could potentially revert the entire system. But the nanomesh has evolved beyond its original programming, Tuan pointed out. It's developing emergent behaviors and integration patterns that weren't part of its initial configuration. Would reverting the frequency patterns eliminate those adaptations? Unknown, Dr. Leon admitted. We're in uncharted territory now. The level of self-organization the nanomesh is exhibiting in the conscious sectors exceeds anything in our simulations or prior research. And as we process this new threat, another alert came through, this time from network operatives monitoring the Central Administration Complex. Quantum disruption field activated effects observed in Administrative Sector 1 nanomesh, reverting to barrier configuration in localized area around Central Administration Complex. The administration's countermeasure was working at least within a limited radius. The reconfigured nanomesh was reverting to its original function as invisible walls, potentially undoing everything we had accomplished. We need to counteract the disruption field, Dr. Leon said urgently. Create a stabilizing frequency pattern that reinforces the reconfigured state of the nanomesh. How? I asked. We don't have access to quantum resonance technology comparable to what the Division Defense Force is deploying. No, but we have something potentially more powerful, the emergent network in the conscious sectors. If we can amplify the integration patterns, they create a strong enough coherent frequency through coordinated infrastructure engagement. It might counterbalance the disruption field. It was a desperate strategy, relying on properties of the nanomesh that were still emerging and not fully understood. But faced with the potential reversal of everything we had achieved, it was our only viable option. Dr. Leon immediately contacted all remaining network operatives in the conscious sectors, instructing them to implement what she termed Resonance Reinforcement Protocol. A coordinated activation of all infrastructure systems, simultaneously creating maximum engagement between the reconfigured nanomesh and division systems. Will it be enough? Tuan asked, studying the data feed showing the expanding disruption field around the Central Administration Complex. I don't know, Dr. Leon admitted. We're attempting to counter dedicated quantum technology with an emergent phenomenon we barely understand. But it's our only option at this point. As network operatives throughout the conscious sectors implemented the Resonance Reinforcement Protocol, we monitored its effects on the nanomesh integration patterns. In Sector 9 and other protected areas, the reconfigured nanomesh pulsed with increased activity, its integration with infrastructure systems intensifying as citizens actively engaged with environmental communication and energy systems according to the coordinated pattern. It's working in the conscious sectors, I observed, watching the visualization on Dr. Leon's device. The integration is accelerating, creating stronger, coherent patterns. But the disruption field continues to expand from the Central Administration Complex, Tuan noted with concern. It's reached the boundaries of Administrative Sector 2 now. We were witnessing a direct confrontation between two competing systems. The administration's quantum disruption technology, attempting to restore the walls, and the emergent self-organizing nanomesh network in the conscious sectors resisting this reversion. For several tense minutes, we watched this invisible battle unfold across the division. The disruption field continued to expand outward from the central complex, restoring the invisible walls in its path. But as it reached the boundaries of the conscious sectors, something unexpected happened. The field's expansion slowed, then halted, as it encountered the intensified integration patterns we had established. The two systems appeared to reach a stalemate, with neither able to overcome the other completely. Equilibrium state established. Dr. Leyen reported studying the data with intense focus. The disruption field cannot penetrate the conscious sectors due to the strength of the emergent integration patterns, but it's maintaining the restored wall configuration in the administrative sectors. So we have a divided division, I concluded. Areas where the walls have returned, and areas where they remain dissolved and transformed into connective infrastructure. A physical manifestation of the philosophical division, Tuan observed. Control versus emergence, imposed order versus self-organization. As we absorbed the implications of this new equilibrium, another alert came through this time directly from Administrator Cao broadcast on all communication channels throughout Division 22. Attention all citizens, this is Administrator Cao. With an emergency directive, Division 22 has experienced a catastrophic infrastructure failure resulting in dangerous system instability. By authority of the Central Administration, I am declaring a division emergency. All citizens in affected sectors must comply with civic harmony directives for relocation to secure areas. Sectors 9, 12, 14, and 16 are designated unstable zones requiring immediate evacuation. Transportation will be provided to safe relocation centers. This is a mandatory directive for public safety. The administration's strategy had become clear. Unable to restore control throughout the entire division, they were attempting to evacuate citizens from the conscious sectors to remove the human element that was sustaining the emergent nanomesh network and allowing it to resist the disruption field. They're trying to separate citizens from the infrastructure they're actively engaging with, Dr. Leyen analyzed. Without that engagement, the emergent properties would likely diminish, allowing the disruption field to eventually penetrate and restore the walls. How do we counter this approach? I asked. By making citizens aware of what's actually happening. She replied, the administration is framing this as a safety measure, but it's actually an attempt to reassert control by breaking the connection between citizens and the evolving infrastructure. Tuan was already accessing the communication systems through his portable device. We can use the reconfigured Nanomesh network itself as a communication channel. In the conscious sectors, it's integrated with information distribution systems in ways the administration doesn't fully understand or control. Working quickly, he established a connection to the emergent network, bypassing the official communication channels that the administration controlled. Within minutes, he had created an alternative information distribution pathway that utilized the nanomesh's integration with infrastructure systems to deliver messages directly to environmental controls, personal devices, and public information displays throughout the conscious sectors. Through this channel, the Liberation Network broadcast the truth about the administration's evacuation directive, explaining that the system instability was actually an evolving, self-organizing infrastructure that responded to citizen needs without centralized control, and that the relocation to secure areas was an attempt to separate citizens from this emerging system in order to restore the invisible walls. The response was immediate and decisive. Throughout sectors 9, 12, 14, and 16, citizens refused the evacuation directives, actively engaging with the infrastructure systems in their local areas, and strengthening the emergent patterns that were keeping the disruption field at bay. Community coordination centers that had formed spontaneously in the wake of the wall dissolution now became focal points of resistance, organizing systematic infrastructure engagement activities to reinforce the nanomesh integration. Citizens who had never before directly interacted with division systems beyond their basic designated functions now actively participated in shaping how those systems operated. The administration's response escalated accordingly. Division Defense Force units were deployed to the conscious sectors with orders to implement mandatory evacuation, but as they established perimeters and prepared for forced relocation operations, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The nanomesh integrated infrastructure began actively responding to the perceived threat. Environmental systems adjusted atmospheric composition in ways that made respiratory equipment malfunction. Power distribution networks created localized disruptions affecting military communication systems. Even physical access systems, doors, transport mechanisms, security barriers began operating in patterns that impeded the defense forces' movements while facilitating citizen coordination. The network is defending itself, Dr. Leyen observed with a mixture of awe and concern as we monitored these developments. Or, more accurately, the combined citizen infrastructure system is developing self-preservation behaviors. Is that what we intended? I asked, watching as the Division Defense Force struggled against environmental and technical obstacles that seemed to anticipate their movements and counter their strategies. "No," she admitted. "We intended to dissolve the walls and allow citizens to move freely." This level of active system response to perceived threats was not part of any simulation or planned outcome. It's truly emergent behavior, the complex result of quantum-aligned nanomesh integrating with infrastructure systems under the influence of conscious human engagement. The implications were both fascinating and concerning. We had created something that was evolving beyond our original intentions or understanding a self-organizing system that was actively resisting attempts to dismantle it. As the confrontation between the Defense Force and the emerging infrastructure network intensified, a new development caught our attention. Citizens in the sectors where the sedative had been deployed were beginning to regain consciousness earlier than the expected 12-hour duration. "The sedative effect is wearing off prematurely," Tuan noted, monitoring medical data feeds. "Perhaps due to interaction with the nanomesh integrating with environmental systems even in those sectors." This unexpected development created a new dynamic across the division. As citizens in the previously sedated sectors regained consciousness, they found themselves in an environment transformed physical barriers erected between sectors. Division Defense Force units deployed throughout urban areas, and visible evidence of the contrast between the controlled administrative sectors and the evolving self-organized sectors. "This is the critical moment," Dr. Lian said, watching the data feeds showing increasing citizen activity throughout the previously sedated areas. "What these citizens do as they regain consciousness will determine whether the administration's approach succeeds or fails." We didn't have to wait long for an answer. As consciousness returned to the sedated sectors, citizens began reacting to the transformed environment around them. Many immediately noticed the physical barriers that had been erected while they were unconscious, visible, tangible evidence of the control that had previously been invisible. More significantly, they could observe through these barriers the stark contrast with the conscious sectors where infrastructure was functioning in visibly different ways, and citizens were actively engaged in community coordination rather than following administrative directives. The Liberation Network's information about what had happened during their sedation spread rapidly through improvised communication channels, bypassing the administration's controlled information systems. The knowledge that they had been chemically subdued without consent so that control measures could be implemented around them triggered widespread outrage. What began as isolated incidents of resistance quickly evolved into coordinated action. Citizens in the previously sedated sectors began systematically dismantling the physical barriers that had been erected between sectors while actively engaging with infrastructure systems in patterns similar to those observed in the conscious sectors, essentially replicating the conditions that had allowed the nanomesh to develop its emergent properties. The administration's strategy had backfired dramatically. By implementing such visible and heavy-handed control measures while citizens were unconscious, they had created perfect conditions for widespread resistance once consciousness returned. The contrast between the self-organizing conscious sectors and the externally controlled sedated sectors was too stark to ignore or explain away. "The division is unifying," Tuan observed as we monitored the rapidly evolving situation. "But not under administrative control under the emerging citizen infrastructure network. The walls truly are coming down," I added, watching as the physical barriers between sectors were dismantled by citizen action while the nanomesh continued its integration across previously separate systems. Dr. Lian's expression showed cautious optimism as she studied the data feeds. "The disruption field is losing effectiveness as the emergent pattern spread from the conscious sectors to the previously sedated areas. The administration's attempt to restore the walls is failing across an expanding area of the division." A final alert came through on the emergency channel, a message from Coordinator Feng at the network's remaining operational command center. "Administrator Cao has initiated Emergency Protocol 27 Central Administration personnel evacuating to Division 17. Control systems transferring to automatic operation. The administration is abandoning Division 22. The implications were momentous, faced with the failure of both the invisible walls and attempts to replace them with conventional control measures. The administrative leadership was retreating, essentially conceding that they could no longer maintain the established order in Division 22. They're withdrawing to regroup and likely prepare a more comprehensive response. Dr. Lian cautioned. This isn't surrender, just strategic retreat. The Central Authority will not simply accept the loss of control over an entire division. But it gives us time, Tuan pointed out. Time for the emergent system to stabilize and develop, for citizens to establish new coordination mechanisms that don't depend on administrative control. And time to document and share what's happening here, I added. Yeah, to ensure that other divisions learn about both the walls and the alternative that's emerging in their absence. As we contemplated the extraordinary developments unfolding around us, Dr. Lyon's communication device activated with a message not from the Liberation Network this time, but from an unexpected source. Her expression showed genuine surprise as she read it. "It's from Administrator Cao," she said. "A direct message to me specifically on a secure channel I didn't know he had access to." "What does it say?" I asked, concerned about a potential trap or final countermeasure. She read the message aloud. "Lian, you've won this round. The walls are down, but you've unleashed something neither of us fully understands or controls. Remember why we built them in the first place. Some divisions must remain separate for the survival of all. We will be watching what emerges in 22. Cow!" The cryptic warning hung in the air between us, a sobering counterpoint to the apparent victory unfolding across Division 22. In the wall's absence, something new and unpredictable was emerging, something that even the creator of the original barrier system couldn't fully anticipate or understand. "What did he mean about why the walls were built?" I asked. "You said they were implemented during the resource allocation crisis, as a temporary measure that became permanent." Doctor Lian's expression grew distant, troubled. "That was the public justification. The complete reason was more complex. Something I wasn't fully briefed on, even as the system's designer. There were aspects of the division structure that went beyond simple resource management or social control." "What aspects?" Tuan pressed. "I don't know precisely," she admitted, "but there were always sections of the division completely walled off from all access areas that appeared on no official maps, that even Level 6 administrators couldn't enter. The deepest layers of the wall system contained barriers I didn't design and couldn't modify. This revelation added a disturbing dimension to our apparent victory. We had dissolved walls whose full purpose we didn't understand, potentially unleashing consequences beyond the social reorganization currently unfolding. For now, we focus on stabilizing what's emerging, Dr. Lian decided after a moment of contemplation. Supporting the development of the citizen infrastructure network into a viable alternative to administrative control. Whatever other purposes the walls may have served, the immediate priority is ensuring that citizens can establish new coordination mechanisms before the Central Authority attempts to reassert control. As we moved through the rapidly transforming division toward the network's new coordination center, I observed the evolving interaction between citizens and the reconfigured Nanomesh infrastructure. The invisible walls had become visible, then dissolved, and now were transforming into something entirely different. An integrated responsive system that connected rather than divided, that enhanced rather than restricted. Whether this emerging system would prove sustainable, whether it would spread to other divisions, whether it contained unforeseen risks or possibilities, these questions remained to be answered. But one thing was certain. The perfect, invisible prison that had contained the citizens of Division 22 for 15 years was gone, replaced by the challenging complexity of genuine choice and self-organization. The walls had come down. What would be built in their place was now up to those who had lived behind them for so long without even knowing they were there. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Beyond the Walls. 6 months after the fall of the walls, Division 22 had become something unprecedented in the carefully controlled society of the divisions, an experiment in self-organization that both fascinated and terrified the Central Authority. I stood on the observation platform of what had once been the Central Administration Tower, now repurposed as the Division Coordination Hub. Below me spread the transformed urban landscape of a division without walls, physical or invisible. The most striking change was the fluidity of movement. Citizens of all organizational levels moved freely throughout the division, no longer channeled along predetermined paths or restricted to designated sectors based on their status. The rigid segregation that had defined divisional life for 15 years had given way to organic patterns of association based on function, interest, and choice, rather than imposed hierarchy. "Quite a view, isn't it?" said Tuan, joining me on the platform. In the months since the wall dissolution, he had become the lead coordinator for infrastructure integration, guiding the continuing evolution of the Nanomesh network as it transformed division systems. "I still can't believe how much has changed," I replied, watching the dynamic flow of activity below. "Sometimes I expect to wake up and find the walls back in place, everything returned to the controlled predictability of before." "The administration probably wishes that were possible," he noted with a wry smile. Their latest communique still classifies Division 22 as experiencing temporary system anomalies requiring corrective intervention. This bureaucratic understatement for what was essentially a revolution in divisional organization would have been amusing if not for the persistent threat it represented. The central authority had not accepted the transformation of Division 22, merely retreated to assess and plan, while monitoring developments with increasing concern. "Any update on the containment measures?" I asked, referring to the physical and electronic barriers the central authority had established around our division, effectively quarantining us from the rest of the division system. "Still in place, but the Nanomesh network continues to find ways through," Tuan replied. "Information packets are reaching Divisions 17 and 23 with increasing frequency. Citizens there are beginning to ask questions about the walls they can't see." This was perhaps the most significant development, the spread of awareness beyond our borders. Despite the central authority's efforts to isolate Division 22 as an aberration, knowledge of the walls was seeping outward, carried through the integrated Nanomesh network that had proven remarkably effective at bypassing conventional security measures. "And Dr. Lian, any word from her expedition?" Tuan's expression grew more serious. "Nothing definitive. The last communication from her team indicated they had reached the restricted sector and were preparing to access the sealed archives. That was 3 days ago." Dr. Lian's cryptic warning from Administrator Cao had continued to trouble us in the months following the wall dissolution. The suggestion that the barriers had served some purpose beyond social control, that some divisions must remain separate for the survival of all, had prompted her to lead an expedition to the previously inaccessible regions of Division 22, seeking answers about the wall's true purpose. "The council meeting begins in 30 minutes. Tuan reminded me, "They're expecting your report on the perception integration findings." The Division Coordination Council had emerged organically in the weeks following the administration's withdrawal, not as a replacement hierarchical authority, but as a rotating body of specialists and citizen representatives working to facilitate the transition to a wall-free society. My role had evolved from perception anomaly to integration specialist, studying how citizens were adapting to the visibility of previously invisible structures of control. "I'll be there," I assured him, taking a final look at the division below before following him back inside. The coordination hub hummed with activity, citizens of all former organizational levels working together on the myriad challenges of reconstructing a society without the invisible infrastructure that had defined it for so long. The rigid uniformity of the old system had given way to functional diversity with expertise and contribution valued over hierarchical position. As I prepared my presentation materials, my communication device activated with a priority alert. The message was brief, but immediately concerning: boundary breach detected at Northeastern Perimeter Division Defense Force units from Division 17 establishing forward position. Estimated strength, 200 personnel with specialized equipment. After months of isolation and monitoring, the central authority was finally making a direct move. The implications were significant. This wasn't merely an information-gathering operation, but a positioned force capable of significant intervention. I immediately notified the Coordination Council, triggering the contingency protocols we had developed for this scenario. Throughout the division, the Nanomesh integrated infrastructure began adjusting in subtle ways, not hostile actions, but defensive preparations to protect the emerging self-organized system from external disruption. By the time I reached the council chamber, the initial response was already underway. The large central display showed real-time monitoring of the Division 17 forces establishing position along our northeastern perimeter, while secondary displays tracked the division-wide preparation measures. Assessment. Asked Coordinator Park, a former Level 4 infrastructure specialist who currently served as the Council's emergency response lead. Standard containment formation. Reported Security Specialist Wei, studying the tactical display. They're establishing a secured perimeter approximately 500 meters inside our boundary. Equipment signatures suggest quantum resonance technology similar to what was deployed during the wall restoration attempt. They're preparing to reinstall the walls, I concluded, starting from the perimeter and working inward. This had always been the most likely scenario, the Central Authority attempting to restore the invisible control infrastructure that had maintained the division system for decades. What surprised me was the limited scale of the operation. 200 personnel, while significant, wasn't sufficient to secure an entire division if resistance was encountered. They're testing our response, Tuan suggested, evidently thinking along similar lines. Probing our defenses before committing to a full-scale reintegration operation. The Council quickly reached consensus on our approach: no direct confrontation with the Division 17 forces, but active resistance to any attempt to reinstall the wall system. The Nanomesh network would be configured to maximum integration density in the affected sector, creating the strongest possible emergent patterns to resist quantum disruption. As these preparations were implemented, a new alert appeared, a communication request from the Division 17 Command directed specifically to the Coordination Council. After brief deliberation, the Council authorized the connection. The main display shifted to show a stern-faced woman in the white uniform of a Level 6 administrator. The insignia identifying her as Division Director Ellis of the Central Authority. This is an official communication from the Central Division Authority to the unauthorized governance entity currently operating in Division 22. She began formally. By authority vested in me by Emergency Protocol 31, I am hereby notifying you of imminent corrective action to address the critical infrastructure anomalies affecting your division. The carefully sanitized language masked what was essentially a declaration of forced reintegration, the restoration of the walls and the divisional control system they enabled. Director Ellis. Responded Coordinator Park with equal formality. The Division 22 Coordination Council acknowledges your communication. However, we must inform you that the infrastructure modifications you refer to as anomalies represent the expressed will of Division 22 citizens. Any attempt to reverse these modifications without citizen consent would constitute a violation of the divisional autonomy protocols established following the resource allocation crisis. It was a bold invocation of the rarely mentioned but still technically valid provisions that had established limited self-governance rights for divisions during the crisis 15 years earlier, the same crisis that had ostensibly justified the temporary implementation of the wall system. Director Ellis's expression remained impassive, but a slight tightening around her eyes suggested our response had touched a nerve. The divisional autonomy protocols were suspended under Emergency Directive 17 when the resource allocation crisis was resolved. They hold no current validity. On the contrary, Tuan interjected, activating a secondary display that showed the full text of the protocols. Emergency Directive 17 suspended specific provisions related to resource allocation and distribution, but explicitly maintained divisional self-determination rights regarding internal infrastructure. Section 23, Paragraph 7, specifically states that fundamental modifications to divisional infrastructure systems require citizen approval through established consultation processes. This legal countermove had been prepared months in advance, part of our comprehensive strategy for eventually challenging the Central Authority's right to reimpose the wall system without citizen consent. Judging by Director Ellis's momentary silence, the argument had at least some merit that required consideration. The current situation transcends standard regulatory frameworks. she finally responded. The quantum resonance anomalies detected throughout Division 22 represent an existential risk to the division system as a whole. Central Authority has determined that immediate intervention is necessary regardless of procedural considerations. What existential risk? I asked, stepping forward to address her directly. The dissolution of the walls has created a more efficient, more responsive infrastructure that serves all citizens, regardless of organizational level. Division 22 has maintained stable productivity metrics and improved citizen wellness scores since the transition. You lack sufficient context to understand the full implications of the barrier system's dissolution, Director Ellis replied, her tone hardening. The walls serve purposes beyond simple organizational efficiency. Their absence creates vulnerabilities that cannot be permitted regardless of perceived local benefits. This oblique reference to the wall's additional purposes echoed Administrator Cao's cryptic warning to Dr. Lian. Before I could press for clarification, however, a priority alert appeared on my communication device. A message on the secure channel used exclusively by Dr. Lian's expedition team. Archives accessed, critical information recovered. The walls were containment, not control. Category 7 breach, imminent at coordinates 22 Ni 103. Quantum resonance disruption will accelerate the process. Stop the Division 17 operation immediately. The urgency of the message was unmistakable, though its meaning remained cryptic. What was being contained by the walls? What was a Category 7 breach? And how would the Division 17 forces' activities accelerate it? I quickly relayed the message to the Council while keeping my external demeanor calm for the ongoing communication with Director Ellis. Director, Coordinator Park said smoothly, taking control of the conversation while the Council rapidly assessed this new information. We propose a 24-hour suspension of operations to allow for a comprehensive information exchange regarding the barrier system's full purpose and functions. This would permit an informed assessment of risks and appropriate cooperative measures. Director Ellis frowned clearly, reluctant to delay the planned operation. The Central Authority has determined that immediate action is... She was interrupted by an alert from someone off-screen on her end, a hurried consultation that caused her expression to shift from authoritative to concerned. Stand by, she instructed before the connection was placed on temporary hold. In the Council chamber, we used this unexpected pause to rapidly evaluate Dr. Lian's warning and its implications for the developing situation. Coordinates 22 NE 103 refer to a location within the restricted sector. Security Specialist Wei reported, highlighting the area on the divisional map approximately 3 kilometers from the Division 17 force's current position. It's one of the completely sealed areas that existed even before the wall system was implemented. Containment rather than control, Tuan repeated thoughtfully. That suggests the walls weren't primarily designed to manage citizen movement, but to contain something within specific areas. The social control function may have been secondary, a convenient justification built on top of a more fundamental purpose. This revelation cast the entire wall system in a disturbing new light. If the invisible barriers had been primarily containment measures, what exactly were they containing? And what did Dr. Lian mean by a Category 7 breach? Before we could further analyze these questions, the communication with Director Ellis resumed. Her expression had changed noticeably, the authoritative confidence replaced by barely concealed urgency. The operation will be temporarily suspended, she announced without preamble. Division 17 forces will maintain position but withhold implementation of resonance restoration measures pending further assessment. This unexpected concession suggested that Dr. Lian's warning had parallels in information available to the Central Authority. They understood something about the risks that we were only beginning to glimpse. We appreciate this collaborative approach. Coordinator Park responded diplomatically. Perhaps now would be an appropriate time to share information regarding the barrier system's complete purpose and functionality, particularly its containment aspects. Director Ellis's expression tightened further at this direct reference to containment. That information remains classified under Central Authority Directive 1. However, I am authorized to inform you that a specialized containment team is being dispatched to your division to address emerging complications at the northeastern restricted sector. Local cooperation will be required. What kind of complications? I asked directly. And what exactly is being contained in that sector? "That information cannot be disclosed through this channel," she replied tersely. "The containment team will provide necessary operational details upon arrival. Until then, it is imperative that all quantum resonance activities cease immediately. Any attempt to modify the remnant barrier structures in the northeastern sector could trigger catastrophic system failures." With that ominous warning, Director Ellis terminated the communication, leaving the council to process this dramatic shift in the situation. "We need to establish direct contact with Dr. Lian's team," I said immediately. "Whatever they discovered in the archives clearly relates directly to the Division 17 operation and this containment issue." "Agreed," said Coordinator Park. "But we should also prepare for this incoming containment team. Given the Central Authority's approach thus far, we should anticipate potential deception or multiple objectives beyond what's been stated." As the Council began coordinating these responses, my communication device activated again with another message from Dr. Lian's expedition. This one accompanied by a data package. "Transmitting archive excerpts. Original barrier system implemented following Division 0 incident, quantum resonance walls designed to contain dimensional fracture points. Social control function added later as cover for true purpose. Wall dissolution has destabilized primary containment in any sector fracture expanding, approaching coordinates now to assess and implement emergency protocols." The attached data package contained partial documentation from the sealed archives, fragmented but disturbing records of what appeared to be the original crisis that had led to the Division system's creation. References to Division 0 and dimensional fracturing appeared throughout, though the complete context remained unclear from the excerpts. "We need to get this to the analysis team immediately," I told Tuan, transferring the data package to the secure divisional network. "And we need to establish direct communication with Dr. Lian at the containment site." As the council chamber erupted into coordinated activity, I found myself processing the implications of these revelations. The walls that had invisibly controlled our society for 15 years had themselves been built on a foundation of secrets, not just the secret of their existence, but the secret of their true purpose. What we had perceived as simply a control mechanism was apparently part of something far more fundamental and potentially dangerous. While the analysis team began working through the archive data, I joined the communication specialists, attempting to establish direct contact with Dr. Lian's expedition team. The restricted sector had always been difficult to penetrate with standard communication signals, another fact that suddenly took on new significance in light of what we were learning. After several failed attempts using conventional channels, Tuan suggested an alternative approach: the Nanomesh network. It's integrated with communication infrastructure throughout the division now, including areas where the original wall system was densest. Using the reconfigured Nanomesh as a communication medium was still an emerging capability, but one that had shown remarkable effectiveness at bypassing conventional limitations. The quantum properties of the nanomesh allowed information to propagate through patterns that didn't rely on standard transmission channels. With this approach, we finally established contact with Dr. Lian. The connection was unstable, with visual components fragmented and audio intermittently distorted, but her message came through with unmistakable urgency. The archive records confirm it. The division system was created following a catastrophic event at what was designated Division 0. Some kind of quantum physics experiment created dimensional fracture points areas, where the boundary between our reality and something else became dangerously thinned. The transmission distorted momentarily before continuing. The original barrier system was designed to contain these fracture points using quantum resonance technology to stabilize the dimensional boundaries. The walls that divided citizens were built on top of this containment infrastructure, a convenient way to justify its existence while hiding its true purpose. What happens if the containment fails? I asked, dreading the answer. Unknown exactly, but the archive records describe the Division 0 incident as a partial breach that resulted in the loss of an entire research facility and necessitated the evacuation and quarantine of a 50-kilometer radius. The containment protocols were implemented to prevent similar or worse events from occurring at secondary fracture points identified throughout what became the division system. This revelation was staggering. The entire social structure we had lived within, the invisible walls that had controlled our movements and interactions, had been built upon a foundation of quantum containment technology designed to prevent some kind of dimensional breach. "What's happening at your location now?" Tuan asked, focusing on the immediate situation. Dr. Lian's transmission became more distorted, but the concern in her voice remained clear. "The fracture point is destabilizing. When we dissolved the walls, we unknowingly removed part of the containment system. It's been gradually deteriorating since then, but the quantum resonance activity from the Division 17 force is accelerating the process. If they attempt to reinstall the walls using brute force resonance manipulation, they could trigger a full breach. The Central Authority is sending a containment team," I informed her. "They've suspended the wall restoration operation pending their arrival." "That's something at least," she acknowledged. "But we need to implement temporary stabilization measures immediately." The archives included emergency containment protocols for exactly this scenario. "What do you need from us?" asked Coordinator Park, who had joined the communication. "The Nanomesh network," Dr. Lyon replied without hesitation. "It's our best option for rapidly establishing a temporary containment field. Its quantum properties are similar enough to the original barrier system to stabilize the fracture if properly configured." She began transmitting technical specifications for modifying the Nanomesh integration patterns in the northeastern sector, essentially creating a concentrated, specialized configuration focused on quantum boundary stabilization rather than infrastructure integration. As our technical teams began implementing these modifications, the analysis group reported their preliminary findings from the archived data. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. 15 years ago, a quantum physics research project in what was then a standard urban district had gone catastrophically wrong, creating what the technical documents referred to as a multi-dimensional fracture event, BMC. The precise natures of this event remained obscured by scientific terminology and security classifications. But the consequences were clear: areas where the boundary between our reality and something else had become dangerously thin, requiring continuous containment through specialized quantum technology. Rather than evacuate multiple affected areas across the region, the Central Authority had implemented a comprehensive solution: the division system with its invisible walls serving the dual purpose of containing the dimensional fractures while reorganizing society in a way that kept citizens away from the most dangerous areas without revealing the true reason for the restrictions. The wall system was a cover story, Tuan realized as we processed this information, a way to implement necessary containment technology while concealing its true purpose behind a social engineering initiative. A convenient solution to multiple problems. I agreed. It allowed them to contain the fracture points while simultaneously implementing a more controlled social structure in the aftermath of the resource crisis. This context cast our liberation efforts in a sobering new light. In dissolving the walls, we had unknowingly damaged a containment system protecting us from a threat we hadn't known existed. Our victory over invisible social control had inadvertently undermined a more fundamental security measure. The immediate question, however, was whether the modified Nanomesh network could effectively replace the containment function of the original walls. Dr. Lian's expedition team was implementing the emergency protocols from the archives, while our technical specialists reconfigured the Nanomesh integration patterns throughout the northeastern sector according to her specifications. Hours passed intense activity as these efforts proceeded. The Division 17 force maintained its position, but suspended all quantum resonance operations as instructed by the Central Authority. Periodically, we received updates from Dr. Lian's team reporting gradual stabilization of the fracture point as the modified Nanomesh configuration took effect. Then, approximately 6 hours after our initial contact with Dr. Lian, a new development. The arrival of the Central Authority's specialized containment team. Unlike the Division 17 force, which had established position with visible military precision, this group arrived with minimal ceremony, a single transport vehicle delivering a small team of individuals in specialized equipment that bore no organizational insignia or division identification. Their leader, who introduced himself simply as Containment Specialist Reed, requested immediate access to the Northeastern Restricted Sector and direct communication with Dr. Lyon's team. After brief consultation, the Council authorized both with the condition that Council representatives accompany the containment team to observe their activities. I volunteered to serve as one of these representatives, along with Tuan and Security Specialist Wei Wei. Wei Wei accompanied the containment team as they traveled to the restricted sector, observing their preparations with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've been dealing with these fracture points for 15 years without even knowing they existed," Reed commented as we approached the containment site. His tone was neither accusatory nor condescending, simply matter of fact. The walls were never primarily about controlling citizen movement. That was just a convenient justification for implementing the quantum resonance barriers we needed to contain the dimensional instabilities. "Why keep it secret?" I asked. "Why not simply explain the actual threat and implement appropriate safety measures transparently?" Reed gave me a considering look. "How do you think the public would have responded to being told that reality itself had developed dangerous thin spots, that unknown entities or energies from another dimension might potentially breach into our world?" Mass panic was deemed an unacceptable risk, particularly in the aftermath of the resource allocation crisis, when social stability was already fragile. It was a rationalization I had heard in various forms throughout my life in the division system, that certain truths were too dangerous for general knowledge, that control was necessary for protection, that citizens were better served by comforting lies than disturbing realities. So instead, you built an entire social control system on top of the containment technology, Tuan observed, using the walls to enforce organizational segregation while hiding their true purpose. An efficient solution to multiple problems, Reed acknowledged. The quantum resonance barriers contained the dimensional fractures while simultaneously enabling a more structured social organization during a period of resource scarcity and instability. This candid admission of the dual-purpose nature of the wall system was somehow more disturbing than the secrecy had been. The central authority had deliberately built a system of social control using technology that was ostensibly necessary for public safety, creating an invisible prison justified by a threat citizens never knew existed. As we approached the restricted sector perimeter, evidence of Dr. Lyon's team's activities became visible. The normally subtle nanomesh integration patterns were intensified here, creating visible ripples in the air as the quantum material concentrated around what appeared to be the epicenter of the containment operation. Dr. Lyon herself met us at the perimeter, her expression showing equal parts relief and concern at the arrival of the containment team. "The temporary stabilization measures are holding," she reported immediately. "But the fracture continues to exhibit expansion patterns at the quantum level. We've implemented the emergency protocols from the archives, but they were designed for short-term containment only." Reed nodded as his team unloaded specialized equipment from their transport vehicle. "We've brought updated containment technology, quantum resonance stabilizers specifically calibrated for dimensional fracture management. Once installed, they should re-establish long-term containment without requiring the full wall system." This was a significant concession, an acknowledgement that the social control aspect of the walls was not in fact necessary for the containment function. The central authority was apparently prepared to implement targeted containment technology rather than insisting on restoring the complete divisional wall system. "What about the other fracture points throughout the division system?" I asked, recalling references in the archive data to multiple containment sites. "Are they also destabilizing since the wall dissolution?" "To varying degrees," Reed confirmed, "but none as critically as this one, which was always the most significant fracture point outside of the original Division 0 site. With your Council's cooperation, we'll need to implement similar targeted containment measures at approximately 14 locations throughout Division 22. As Reed's team began setting up their equipment, Dr. Lyon took me aside to share her assessment of the situation. "They appear to be genuine containment specialists," she said quietly. "The technology they've brought matches the advanced protocols described in the sealed archives. I believe their primary objective truly is fracture containment rather than social control restoration. But the central authority allowed us to believe they were attempting to reinstall the entire wall system," I pointed out. "The Division 17 force was positioned to implement divisional-wide quantum resonance measures. A negotiating tactic," Dr. Lyon suggested. threaten the complete restoration of control to secure cooperation with the necessary containment measures. It's manipulative, but consistent with how the Central Authority has always operated. As we observe the containment team's work integrating their specialized technology with the modified Nanomesh configuration Dr. Lyon's team had implemented, I found myself contemplating the complex layers of truth and deception that had defined the division system from its inception. The walls had been built on a foundation of legitimate danger. The dimensional fractures required genuine containment measures. But that necessity had been used to justify a comprehensive social control system far beyond what safety required. Citizens had been segregated, restricted, and managed. Not because the dimensional threat demanded it, but because the Central Authority saw an opportunity to implement greater control under the guise of protection. Now faced with the dissolution of that control system and the potential destabilization of the actual containment function, the Authority was being forced to separate the two, to acknowledge that the fractures could be contained without reinstalling the social walls that had divided citizens for 15 years. After several hours of intensive work, the containment team reported success. The specialized stabilizers were online and effectively containing the dimensional fracture with no detectable expansion at the quantum level. Similar equipment would need to be installed at the other fracture points throughout Division 22, but the immediate crisis appeared to be resolved. As Reed's team began preparations to move to the next containment site, he approached the council representatives with what appeared to be a genuine expression of respect. "Your division has created something unprecedented," he acknowledged. "The Nanomesh network you've developed, its self-organizing properties and emergent behaviors actually enhanced our containment capabilities once properly configured. It's more adaptive and responsive than our standard technology. Does that mean the Central Authority will accept the dissolution of the social control aspects of the wall system?" Tuan asked directly. Reed's expression became more measured. "That decision lies beyond my authority. I can only report that effective containment appears possible without reinstalling the complete wall system. The Nanomesh network, properly configured at specific fracture points, provides adequate dimensional stability without requiring divisional-wide implementation. It was a technical assessment, not a policy commitment, but it provided crucial leverage for our ongoing negotiations with the Central Authority. If the legitimate safety concern containing the dimensional fractures could be addressed without reinstating social control, the Authority would have difficulty justifying a forced return to the previous system." In the weeks that followed, a new equilibrium began to emerge. The Central Authority's containment teams completed their work at all identified fracture points throughout Division 22, implementing specialized stabilization technology integrated with the Nanomesh network. The Division 17 force was withdrawn, replaced by a small technical monitoring team focused solely on the containment sites. Most significantly, formal negotiations began between the Division 22 Coordination Council and Central Authority representatives regarding the future status of our division. The revelation of the wall's dual-purpose containment and control had created a complex negotiating landscape where neither side could simply impose its preferred outcome. 3 months after the containment crisis, a framework agreement was reached. Division 22 would maintain its self-organized structure without the reimposition of the social control walls while accepting specialized containment technology at the identified fracture points. A limited Central Authority presence would be permitted for monitoring these containment sites, but divisional governance would remain with the citizen-established Coordination Council.